Our newspaper roundtable guests will be author and journalist David Frum and Christopher Hitchens, a contributing editor to Vanity Fair. At 10:30, we'll cover a Senate Intelligence Committee hearing with outgoing CIA Director John Deutsch on the year in the intelligence community. Now, Washington Journal.
Across from the Capitol and right around the corner from the C-SPAN building sits the headquarters for the Teamsters Union. There's the building right there, a live picture. Pretty soon the Teamsters will know who their leader is going to be, as ballots are being counted right now in a mail-in election. Current President Ron Kerry is running against James Hoffa. We're going to talk about that and a lot more on today's Washington Journal. Here's the lineup for this Wednesday, the 11th of December. We're going to talk first with Bill Nichols of USA Today, who is here for our Daybook segment. We're going to ask you to share some of your newspaper headlines with us from around the country. In our newspaper roundtable segment, in about an hour, David Frum of the Manhattan Institute, he's also an author, and Christopher Hitchens of Vanity Fair. They'll join us to talk about the newspapers and all the issues involved for about an hour. And in our feature segments today, as we said, the future of the Teamsters Union. Tim Shorrock of the Journal of Commerce is following that story. We're going to check in with him. And a bit later, an update on capital punishment 20 years after the reinstatement of the death penalty in the U.S. Richard Dieter is with the Death Penalty Information Center, and John Pemberton is with the Washington Legal Foundation. So we have a busy morning here. We're going to go the full 3 hours, and we're going to start here with Bill Nichols. Good morning.
Good morning.
President Clinton will speak today to the Democratic Leadership Council here in Washington, an organization which he once ran. And Gerald Seib, in today's Capital Journal column in the Wall Street Journal, points out that this will be the most serious policy speech Mr. Clinton gives between his election and his inauguration. So it bears watching for signs of what is to come in the next 4 years. You going to be there? And
I will be.
What will you be watching for?
Later on today. Well, this is actually one of the few times that the President has given a serious policy speech since the election. There's been a lot of downtime for him in this long trip to Asia. This has become an annual sort of barometer on where Bill Clinton is after the '94 elections, where the Democrats lost badly. The President was criticized quite openly at the DLC meeting. In 1995, it kind of set the tone for his re-election campaign. And this year we're looking for, I don't think, anything particularly new. He's going to talk about the vital center in American politics, moderate politics, but it's our first chance to get in any depth what his thinking has been since the election, any new wrinkles, any new policy proposals that he wants to make, though at least what we're hearing from the White House is there won't be anything particularly new in this speech, but it's a good way to kind of get a feeling for where he is at the moment.
Let's talk about depth just for a little bit. In this side piece here, they talked to Al Frum, president of the DLC. He points to three specific areas that he's looking to hear from the president. The first is in entitlements. In his speech, the president could make historically significant fixes that save Medicare and Social Security. Second area is education. We'd like to see a second administration start a makeover of elementary and high school education. And the third area is welfare, where Mr. Clinton's mission should be to follow this year's welfare reform with an ambitious and coherent plan to find work for those who will be pushed off the dole.
I think Al will be happy on one of those 3 points. I think the President will talk about education at some length. I would be very surprised if there's anything very substantive on the issue of entitlements. And on welfare, that may be one of the few issues where Clinton and the DLC still have some disagreements, at least in how there is a follow-through to the Welfare Reform Act that was passed last year. I don't think many DLCers will be particularly happy if the First Lady is put in charge of overseeing how that act is put into effect in the states, and we've been given some indications that that will be the case. He's going to touch on all those topics. I think education will be where you get the most specifics.
That speech by President Clinton will be happening about 12:15 Eastern Time today. We are going to have live coverage now. It'll either be on C-SPAN or C-SPAN 2. Now, the reason we say that is we're going to have live coverage of a hearing at 10:30 concerning intelligence. Not quite sure when that's going to end. So if it's 12:15 and the President started and that hearing is still going on, we'll have it on C-SPAN 2. And we'll have it, of course, taped tonight in prime time. We'll let you know a little bit more later. We're here with Bill Nichols of USA Today for our Daybook segment. Let's check out your front page here, see what's going on there.
An interesting story on the front page that Bill Welch, one of our congressional writers, has done. One of several stories that are out there today indicating the difficulty that the administration is going to be having actually putting into effect any sort of balanced budget. Bill's piece concerns a 25% cut that the administration is talking about in the subsidy for home heating bills, which is a reversal from last year, and which ironically has now got Republicans complaining after they had tried to do this last year and then were stopped by the administration. So sort of a primer in the way that Washington works. There also is a story in the Wall Street Journal, I believe, in which Secretary Cisneros, outgoing HUD Secretary Cisneros, has written an angry letter protesting some proposed cuts in HUD in the new budget. At least I think I saw that flag.
That story there.
The other story I would point to in USA Today was written by my partner in covering the White House, Susan Page. She attended a political science class that was taught by former White House political consultant Dick Morris. One of Mr. Morris's attempts to, I've got it right here, to rehabilitate himself. And one quote will give you the flavor of the class. He tells one 26-year-old political science major, one Tyler Perrin Reagan, in talking about, in defending political consulting, quote, find a candidate you think will win. It basically requires the ability of an academic and the canniness of a drug pusher. You want to get them hooked, talking about candidates you would be working for on your paper. You want to get them dependent on you. This story goes on to look at Mr. Morris's book that he has either written or is in the process of writing that'll talk about his role in Clinton's reemergence and successful re-election campaign. So an interesting story. Dick's been out of the news for a while, so here he is.
He points out his prescription for coming back. Number one, apologize. Number two, excuse me, don't make excuses. And then consider yourself inoculated from further questions and criticism.
Right, this is a bit of a slow time in Washington, but one of the things that definitely has the attention of the White House is what exactly is going to be in Dick Morris's memoir. There's a keen amount of interest in that within the walls of the White House.
We'll talk for a couple more minutes, but I do want to jump in to let the viewers know. We'll put the phone numbers up on the screen for you. You can phone in with your newspaper articles. That is your ticket to this morning's program. We want to hear new information from around the country, and we'll be talking to you in just a couple minutes as soon as we can get some calls going here. There is a labor story on the front page of the Washington Post today. It concerns the replacement for Labor Secretary Robert Reich, who is one of those departing here. What's happening here in terms of a replacement?
Well, the President has made, as most of your viewers probably know, his major national security appointments, and we've now moved to the domestic and economic area. Robert Reich is leaving, and there is a lot of attention being given by a lot of people in Washington to who will replace him. Labor is very interested in Harris Wofford, the former senator from Pennsylvania and current National Service Director, replacing him. The African American lobby and friends of the administration are very interested in Alexis Herman, who has been a White House aide and very close to both Clintons, to take that job. So it's unclear which way that's going to go. There's several appointments like that, and the President, while he has tried to make diversity less of an issue in staffing his second term, he made such a big deal about it 4 years ago that it's still something that he has to follow through for, and which is key in the way that constituency groups look at how this process unfolds.
And speaking of vacancies, business section of the New York Times today talks about another one. Clinton's chief economist accepts post at World Bank. It's Joseph Stiglitz, who served for about a year and a half as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. He's moving on to become chief economist at the World Bank, so that's another position that's open.
Yeah, the whole economic area is one in which the president has to sort out what he wants to do. That replacement, a replacement for Laura Tyson at the National Economic Council, I think it's probably going to be several weeks before we see how that unfolds.
First call, Columbus, Georgia. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
Doing fine.
Good. What are you reading?
The Columbus Ledger.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw an article in there about the Nobel Prize winners that have been fighting the human rights violations in Indochina.
Mm-hmm.
And I also saw a clip on the news on TV where the protesters were being beaten and things like that. And what I'm wondering is, why is President Clinton sending F-16 fighter planes, nuclear reactors, and money to a country that beats and kills its own people and has such gross human rights violations? I thought Clinton cared.
I think that's going to be a key issue throughout the second term, is our relationship with China. As we saw when the president made this most recent foreign trip to Australia and Manila and Bangkok, was that plans were announced for reciprocal state visits with China, which met a lot of criticism back here at home. The administration has clearly decided that engagement is the way to go after lurching about trying to find a policy during the past 4 years. So specifically to answer your question, they feel that engagement is the best way to try to deal with human rights abuses while still continuing to speak out about practices by the Chinese government that they disagree with. But this is going to be a continuing story, and it's going to be a very difficult path for the administration to navigate for the next 4 years.
Staying on China, a gentleman named Chu Haotian is the chief of staff, or China's defense minister. He spoke in Washington yesterday, a speech we had on C-SPAN, and he defended the 1989 military attack at Tiananmen Square and claimed none were killed in the bloody confrontation, as the Washington Times points out there.
He also met with the president yesterday at the White House, a visit that had to be rescheduled because it had been set. I'm sorry, he met on Monday. It had been scheduled for Tuesday, which ironically was Human Rights Day, which the president commemorated yesterday at the White House, which probably wasn't the best time to be seeing the defense chief from China. Again, this is a harbinger of things to come. It's a very difficult policy to try to navigate and to show people that it makes sense.
This article points out that he was shunned by most Republican members of Congress during a breakfast reception on Capitol Hill, which was attended mostly by Democrats. And we have some reaction also from the Hill. A spokesman for Senator Jesse Helms, who is the Foreign Relations Committee chairman, says his remarks were, quote, appalling, and compared them concerning Tiananmen to Joseph Stalin's denials of killing millions of people under Soviet rule.
I think this could really shape up as the big foreign policy battle for Clinton of the second term, probably replacing Bosnia is where he knocks heads with Congress the most.
Let's go to Binghamton, New York. Hello.
Yes, hello. I'm reading the Press and Sun Bulletin, which is also a Gannett paper. I guess there's about, what, 93 of them now?
I think that's right.
Kind of like the McDonald's of newspapers. Well, the front page is, it says, the U.S. deficit, a record exports decline in quarter. And this is a L.A. Times, Washington Bureau. And it says here, at the current rate of growth, the U.S. account deficit would reach $164 billion by the end of the year. This really concerns me, considering 50% of our exports are now going to our own factories. At the formula of 20,000 jobs per billion of export, that's a loss of 3,280,000 jobs. Now, we have to keep focus of this. We have to do something about it, because I think it's killing our economy.
What do you think should be done?
Well, we have to do what other countries do, like Japan. They protect their markets. Canada, let's say, for example, a factory up in Canada sells 80% of its goods inside Canada. Well, by law, they're required to keep 80% of the production in Canada. Now, we're not protecting our markets here. And the CPI, I don't know how they figured that out, when all our manufacturing base is now out of the country. So how do you put value added on a goods if they're made cheaper outside? And why isn't the cost, like Lee Iacocca says, it's a no-brainer? How come we're not getting cheaper goods with our manufacturing base leaving the country?
All right, caller. USA Today, your paper, has a couple of different looks at this. The main headline in the business section talks about the $48 billion deficit, and in the editorial section here it talks about shock. Trade gap widens, round up usual suspects. They point out here, well, if the nation wants to blame anyone, it can start by blaming itself for a strong economy, for generosity, for its open market, for encouraging U.S. exports. Fill us in here.
A couple of points. Again, we come back to China, which is one of the most egregious sinners on this topic, and where, again, the president is going to meet a lot of resistance in warming relations with Beijing when the trade deficit with China, I forget the figure, was the highest that it's been in some time, at least I believe the September number, which was recently released. Secondly, on the caller's suggestion about erecting more barriers to cheap imports. I think the Clinton administration answer to that would be that the election was somewhat of a referendum on just that topic. There was a Republican candidate in Pat Buchanan and Mr. Perot on the independent side who made that a fairly constant issue. It was one of the prime things that they campaigned about, and the majority of the voters did not support that.
Norfolk, Virginia. Good morning to you.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, what's in your paper?
The Pentagon is accused of stonewalling.
Which issue are you referring to?
Pardon?
Which issue are you referring to?
The Virginian pilot.
Okay. Which issue regarding the Pentagon, though? You said stonewalling. In what area?
The Persian Gulf War chemical
okay.
situation. Major Randy Hebert, who was a Marine, spoke yesterday on Capitol Hill.
Got the picture right here, caller. Go ahead.
Yes. He made some amazing statements.
What was amazing to you? What did you note in particular?
He said to tell Americans that the U.S. exported chemical precursors to Iraq prior to the war. He was asked about what his question would be. He said that in May and in October of 1994, in front of the Senate, it was proven that the U.S. sent the chemicals which have killed and are killing Marines.
Caller, what was your reaction when you heard all this?
I don't know what to say. Both of these men, in fact there were 4, said specifically the U.S. Department of Defense, the intelligence community, which includes defense intelligence, and the White House military intelligence group lied. They lied to the soldiers. They lied to the taxpayers. And the defense, military, arms group are selling, even now,
Bill Nichols,
weapons.
Bill Nichols, did you see the hearing?
I saw a little bit of it on television last night. I think this is an issue that has become just curiouser and curiouser. You had these missing logs this week. We seem to be going through a pattern of questions are raised and the Pentagon reassures everyone that these questions have been answered, and then there's more information that emerges that raise further questions. And I think that the new Congress is going to spend a significant amount of time looking into this. There's a lot of concern, I know, at the White House about where this is going. But this is obviously something that the public is going to want much clearer answers than they've gotten so far.
Speaking of the new Congress, we do want to point out today another one of the stories. It's a follow-up to what we've been talking about down in Texas. There were 3 undecided congressional districts, and those elections are clear now. We have a picture there of Representative Ken Benson, who has won another term, so that's 1 race. And Representative Steve Stockman, a Republican, lost a special runoff election today to a former tax assessor named Nick Lampson. And there's a 3rd race involving 2 Republicans. State Representative Kevin Brady has won that race as well. There's pictures of Mr. Lampson and Mr. Brady. Before all of this, the Republicans held the House around 227 to 205, so not a great impact in terms of the numbers on the Hill.
Right. No, it doesn't make a lot of difference in terms of the pure numbers.
All right. And we go down to Texas, to Austin. Good morning to you. You're reading the American Statesman?
Yes, sir.
Following those races at all?
Yes, sir. The really shock is that the Texas Senate, first time since 1870, is now in Republican hands. They're going to have one more special election over at East Texas, and the Democrats can't even find a candidate to run. When you start looking at the demographics of what's happening here in Texas, and I think this is going to have lots of national importance, I would be willing to bet you that Tom Pauken, running for the national chairmanship of the Republican Party, is most likely going to have a pretty good chance of winning that. I know it's not very chic for Washington, D.C. to consider this, because he hasn't been, he used to work for Ronald Reagan, and then he came down here in Texas and completely revitalized the Republican Party on a grassroots level. And, you know, we've got our George Bush Jr. that some people are touting for the next presidential race. Then you've got Tom Pauken now beginning to get into the sphere of the national reporting chairman.
Senator,
out there in West Texas on this Senate seat, you know, the last time that they had elections out there, the Democrats, the most they ever got was 37%.
Yeah, caller, and Senator Hutchison was on a couple weeks back and also talked about judgeships in Texas, making the point that Republicans are in place all across the board. Which of the congressional districts are you in Austin?
Well, I'm over here in the Senate District 10 over here, but the one they had the election last night was out in West Texas in Lubbock.
Right.
That was Senate District 28.
All right. And thanks for checking in, caller. Any reaction to what you
Well, just the irony is that this was a state that was still very difficult for Bob Dole to win during the past election. So certainly everything the caller says is true about the Republican surge of strength in Texas. But yet it was a state that the Democrats thought that they had a real chance to win until the end.
Let's go ahead and take our first call from California, Los Angeles. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. How are you this morning?
Pretty good. How are you?
Fantastic. Actually, this is a bit of an older story. It's from last Monday, Los Angeles Times. And I was wondering if Mr. Nichols might comment on this story. The headline reads, "A sure thing goes awry." And the thrust of the article is regarding a developer in New Orleans who had planned the largest casino in the world, and it failed. And I was wondering if you might comment, one, on the proliferation of the casino industry throughout the country, and also, tax implications, because many of the cities are looking for, that are looking into allowing casinos, are looking at it as a savior, basically, creating a larger tax base and things. If you could just comment very briefly on that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. As you may be aware, that's become an issue of some interest on the Hill. Started during the last session. I would expect that it would continue this time, looking at exactly that question, the proliferation of gambling, how appropriate that is, do safeguards need to be put on it. I've spent a lot of time reporting in Louisiana, and I'm not sure how good a case study it is, given the historic problems with corruption and so forth that that city and Louisiana as a whole has suffered through. Certainly, it's resulted in just a near economic catastrophe on a lot of levels for New Orleans. It's brought in very little of the economic revitalization that they were looking for.
Staying with economics, but turning specifically to taxes. Couple stories in the tax report today, the Wall Street Journal. One of them concerns an airline ticket tax. Mr. Lott and Mr. Daschle and others endorsed a quick reinstatement of several taxes that will expire at the end of the year. Among them are a 10% federal excise tax. The Treasury is interested in quick action as well, but the House members don't sound as if they're in any rush. This was an issue we saw last year during the budget shutdown, right?
Yeah, you've got a whole host of issues like this that many of them were kind of pushed under the rug to get through this past November the 5th. The other examples that we talked about earlier, our story about the administration's proposed cutback in home heating subsidies. Both sides of the budget divide are now facing some very difficult decisions that have real-life consequences for a lot of Americans, and this is yet another example. I think we're probably going to have to wait past the inaugural to see which way a lot of this stuff is going to go.
And for those who can afford it, attention car buyers in the Wall Street Journal. Buying a luxury car will be cheaper beginning next month as part of a 1990 law scaling down the taxes. They use an example here that a tax on a new $56,000 car starting next month will fall by $380 to $1,600, and in 1998 that tax rate will drop another percentage point. Moving on to Potomac, Maryland. Good morning to you.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. I was up all night watching the hearings that Christopher Shays had, and the article I'm talking about is the New York Times, 2 articles in the last 2 weeks about Gulf War veterans can trace their illnesses back to the Persian Gulf.
Caller, what interests you and what keeps you up all night watching that hearing?
Because I have been bedridden for 9 years with an excruciatingly painful disease called chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia. And it was caused by food poisoning, by chemicals in Houston, Texas. And there's a lot of soldiers who believe that chemical weapons were sent to Saddam Hussein from Houston, Texas in the early 80s. And when we give pyristigmine bromide pills to the soldiers, that alone can cause central nervous system damage, like we saw these soldiers testifying yesterday to Congressman Shays and then repeated last night.
Yeah, as I said before, I think this is going to be one of the major stories of the coming year. Probably first we're going to see it raised at the hearings for Secretary-designate Bill Cohen at the Defense Department. There's just a muddle of bad information right now that the Pentagon is going to have to be much more forthcoming about.
And we'll look to replay that hearing at some point over the weekend. We'll let you know about a specific time. The caller mentioned Saddam Hussein also making news in another area, the oil area in the Washington, or the New York Times rather, in a lot of papers. Iraq resumes pumping oil through a pipeline to Turkey. How did that come about, and is there any worldwide impact?
Worldwide impact, I don't think there's really that much. It's been an on-again, off-again thing that got put off during the brief flare-up of near hostilities between the United States and Iraq with the actions in the Kurdish area last fall. And the administration has now acquiesced, and I don't think this is seen as at least having major economic ramifications.
We also want to talk about a meeting concerning NATO. We'll do that in a couple minutes, but we'll get some more calls in first. North Carolina, Forest City, you're next.
Oh, thank you.
Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Am I on your program?
You sure are.
Okay.
What's your article?
Okay. My name is Ramsey, and just like it's the Atlanta Constitution Journal. It's about this whole mess in the Gulf War and the chemical warfare. And, sir, there's one sure way to stop all the lies and cover-up is to cancel pensions. All these bureaucrats and generals that are lying and covering up, our troops have been suffering. They've known about it for years, and they just need to cancel their pensions. I guarantee you, with that thread over their head, the truth will come out. And that's all I have to say this fine morning.
All right. Caller, do you have any unique connection to that particular issue?
Yes, sir. I know several military people. I have a brother-in-law that was a colonel in the U.S. Marines over there, and it's all a big cover-up. They knew about it from day one. And the Congress needs to get in on this thing. And if they catch these generals and all these other bureaucrats, and the Pentagon needs to be cleaned out just like the CIA. Clean house, and America can start all over again.
All right. several calls this morning. Is this an indication of how the country perhaps might feel?
I think so. I think this is a real building issue, and it's going to be interesting to see where it goes from here.
Charlotte, North Carolina.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I'm calling about the Gulf War chemicals again. Troops say they found chemicals. High-tech gear identified weapons during and after the Gulf War. I also watched the hearings yesterday, and I was very disturbed that our young men and women were not being protected, and that this was being covered up, and that we as Americans, that this is not our highest priority to see that these young men are taken care of. And I think it ought to start with the president. I'm very alarmed that our mainstream newspapers aren't carrying it even more, even though I was very happy to see that we had it on our front page carrying a piece from the New York Times. And I think we ought to write our congressman, and this should start with the commander-in-chief, our president.
All right. Let's move on to Atlanta. Go ahead, please.
Yes, the Clinton stand against California in Proposition 209. I was just stunned that after having campaigned so diligently out there, where they went toe to toe with Bob Dole, that suddenly now having just barely won California, the big tamale out there, now he's just turned 180 degrees. I mean, I'm a Southern Democrat. I've never understood Bill Clinton, but this one just takes the cake. I'm trying to understand what he's up to.
Is that being reported on in your paper out there?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, I don't know if he's yet turned 180 degrees. It's a little bit unclear what position he's going to take. The President was asked about this during a photo opportunity yesterday, and the answer that we got is that there's a legal review being done by the White House right now that he hasn't seen yet. So he's still hedging his bets on whether or not the White House will take any formal role in the litigation involving Prop 209. But the caller is certainly correct in saying that he was far from as outspoken yesterday as he was during the campaign.
While we're on the President and the White House, before the show you were talking about James Carville and his role concerning Kenneth Starr. 3 articles we found together, and we made the deduction here that there are different takes on all of them. Start with your paper.
Yeah, I haven't seen a single, I mean, James is often hard to understand, but I haven't seen a single story today that has the same take. Our headline says Carville said he'd call off the dogs if Clinton asked. There's a story in the Washington Post in which it basically says that James considers his campaign against Special Prosecutor Kenneth Starr over and won. And then, I don't know if we've got it here, but there's a story in the Los Angeles Times that has a headline saying Carville ready to continue his campaign against Ken Starr. This is one thing that I think will be interesting for viewers is the President's going to have a press conference on Friday afternoon. At least that's what the schedule looks like now. This is going to be one key point, is trying to get him to make a declarative sentence one way or the other about whether or not he supports what James Carville is doing or whether or not he opposes it. I think the feeling in Washington at the moment is that whether or not James goes ahead with paid ads or television or whatever, he's basically made his point by inserting into the public dialogue some questions about the partisanship of Ken Starr.
Let's go to Fayetteville, Arkansas. Our next call.
Yes, I'm calling the Gulf War story that's been breaking in the last few days, and I've listened to your other callers. But there was something that they have not mentioned.
What was that?
That is the allegations, and of course I think the American public is due some explanations about not only chemicals that our troops were exposed to, but biological agents, and they have been brought back to their families. Their babies are being born deformed, worse than the thalidomide babies. Where can we have no confidence in our government? It goes back to the Bush administration. It has penetrated into the Clinton administration. we need some truth out here. And I have no connection. I have no one involved.
Mm-hmm.
But this biological thing, it can spread throughout the world if these are communicable biological things that have infected our troops. Does Mr. Nichols has he heard, has he done any investigation on this? I'm so upset.
Yeah, I haven't personally. The newspaper certainly has and will continue to. I think you've seen this get increasing play in the national media, probably reflected in your newspapers and television stations there at home. And this is not something that's going to go away anytime soon, at least in terms of the media scrutiny on it.
Fort Wayne, Indiana. Next call.
Yes, sir. I'm
Hi.
a former sergeant with 2nd Armored Division.
Mm-hmm.
And the doctrine they taught us was Russian doctrine. Senator Regal published a study and released findings of all the chemical munitions that were in the purest form, made in the United States, and shipped to Iraq before the war. They did this so they know what Iraq would have, what we were going against. It also was so that if somebody was to get sick, they could get them well because they knew the contents of the chemical weapons and stuff. But they didn't realize when in a chemical warfare Russian doctrine, they make what's called a cocktail. They'll take sarin, they'll take mustard gas, they'll take something else and mix it all together. Senator Regal is not in office anymore, and he has a very thorough published report. You can check on it yourself. And it lists all of the chemicals that were sent to him and what happens for each chemical, what chemical causes what, and so forth. But you mix all these together and release them in the air, it may not be enough to kill you now, but it'll get into your system and kill you later.
Caller, thanks for adding all that. We mentioned responses earlier. Talked about hearings and what you expect from the president on Friday. Talk a little bit about the Defense Secretary-designate, William Cohen. Steve Boyer, an Indiana Republican and Gulf War veteran, according to this AP story that we've been showing, had hoped that Mr. Cohen will, quote, clean house with some of the people who have been stonewalling.
That will be interesting to see. I'm sure your viewers are aware, Bill Cohen is a retiring senator from Maine, a Republican, who will nevertheless be, at least in all likelihood, joining the president's administration. I'm sure that there will be major changes. I think it's always a little difficult for a civilian without a lot of military experience coming into the Pentagon and cleaning house. I think at the hearings that will attend Bill Cohen's confirmation, that's going to be a key issue, and if there is anyone who's found directly responsible for this lack of information, at least on this issue, clearly that would be something that he would need to attend to very early on in his tenure.
5 minutes left with Bill Nichols of USA Today, Fairfax, Virginia.
Hi, Paul.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Paul, in regards to the mention as the chemical warfare, we have another scandal, if you want to call it that, will be coming up as far as the military is concerned when you have in Central Africa tremendous AIDS epidemic, and we're going to send troops over into Zaire? Really? But I wanted... that's not my story today. I have on page A10 of the Fairfax Journal of Monday, May 25. And the headline over on the right-hand side reads, Virginia to pass up U.S. money. And this is an AP story out of Norfolk. It reads very quickly, Virginia will lose an additional $14.9 million over the next 2 years if state officials continue to snub the Federal Goals 2000 program. Another paragraph, Virginia is the only, get this, Virginia is the only state that has refused to accept money under the Goals 2000. And another paragraph, Virginia's Goal 2000 allocations in the first year, it was increased by 300%. And guess what? Those monies that were not accepted by Virginia were redistributed to other states.
Caller, why does it say why it wasn't accepted?
Yes, we don't want it. Don't want it because there's too many strings attached. And then this last year, between 6.2 million up to 8.7 million in 1997, that's an increase of 40%. There's too much strings attached to this giveaway Goals 2000 money. My concern is, hey, why are we redistributing Virginia's share to other states? And question number two, why can't other states give up this money that's giveaway programs?
All right, caller.
That's a tough one for me to really respond to. I don't know any of the specifics of the case. Certainly Goals 2000 is something that the President wants to make a hallmark of his second term. If you're watching C-SPAN later this morning, you can hear this speech that he's giving to the Democratic Leadership Council, which I'm sure he'll talk about that at some length. But I'm just not familiar with the specifics of the case you're talking about.
I didn't mean to change subject so drastically, but we did say we'd talk about NATO real quick, and I'll just leave things with that. New York Times today taking steps to expand ranks into Eastern Europe and talk specifically about nuclear weapons in some of the new places, or the lack of.
Yeah, I think the major thing to come out of this meeting yesterday is that there's now a firm date set for the NATO meeting. It will be July the 8th and 9th in Madrid, in which some new members actually will be offered membership. Great care was taken yesterday in the pronouncements that were put out, and also in some comments by President Clinton, to try to once again calm Russian fears about this. This, along with China, which we talked about earlier, is going to be one of the major foreign policy stories of the year, something that unfortunately got very short thrift during the campaign, and I think something that those of us in the media need to do a better job of educating our readers and viewers about. It's a major, major story, and you're going to be hearing a lot more about it.
Bill Nichols, we'll let you get to work now. I know you're going to the President's speech later today. You've been with USA Today for more than a decade,
right.
White House correspondent for a couple of years. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks.
And we'll be back in a couple minutes.
Coming up later, we'll talk to writers David Frum, who's a senior fellow with the Manhattan Institute, and Christopher Hitchens, a contributing editor with Vanity Fair. Next, Tim Shorrock, an investigative reporter for the Journal of Commerce, tells us about the future of the Teamsters Union. But first, the lighting of the Capitol Christmas tree from yesterday with House Speaker Newt Gingrich and others.
Put your hand.
One.
Tuck where you did.
Washington Journal continues.
As we said at the top of the program, the Teamsters are holding an election. Tim Sharrock is with the Journal of Commerce. He's an investigative reporter. Good morning.
Good morning.
Give us an idea of what's going on. They're counting the ballots now, right?
Right. They started yesterday, and they're going to make their first. This is a government-supervised election, and the first press conference is going to be this afternoon. First results, early results, but we probably won't know the full results until probably Thursday or Friday.
It is Ron Carey, the incumbent, who served one term so far.
Right, 5 years.
Right? And James Hoffa,
right,
son of Jimmy Hoffa.
Son of Jimmy Hoffa.
Before I ask you for a thumbnail bio sketch, I wanted to point out one word that I saw in several of the stories here was bitter in terms of the race and the election. Give us a little bit of background here.
Well, bitter is the word. It's been a very strongly worded campaign on both sides. You have Jimmy Hoffa, the son of the Jimmy Hoffa, whose image is colored labor for many years, running against Ron Carey, and they both accuse each other of being connected with organized crime. There's been, bitter accusations from the Hoffa side that Carey has kind of sold out the members through contracts that a lot of members felt were unfair, and so there's been kind of some dirty tricks, I'd say, that have popped up in the last couple of weeks that people have complained about on both sides.
New York Times story here by Stephen Greenhouse points out that Mr. Hoffa has run a stronger campaign than many Carey supporters expected, partly because union members are attracted to his famous name. Do you agree with that?
Well, he wouldn't be running without his name. There's no doubt about that. I think that what he's done is used membership anger over a 1994 contract. And you have to go back a few years. In 94, there was a strike against what are called less than truckload carriers, and these are trucking companies that what they do is consolidate loads, like a company like Johnson & Johnson that doesn't move a full shipment of goods. They put some goods and then it's mixed in with other companies. And they struck these companies, and it was a long strike, and about 100,000 people went out, and they depleted the strike fund. And this and then ended up with a contract that a lot of people felt was a concessionary contract. The companies were trying to add more part-timers, and Carey and the Teamsters struck them on that issue. Ended up, they had to make some concessions, cutting workers' overtime, so they could, over a certain period, hire part-timers after people worked a full day. And, that made a lot of people angry. And when you have economic hard times like we do now, pressures from employers, people tend to look at it, try to find a scapegoat, and so I think Hoffa has used his name and then it used the membership anxiety about the economy and about their jobs to go after Carey and say they're spending too much on international campaigns, or they've depleted the strike fund, they've depleted our resources, and we need to restore the Teamsters. That's what Hoffa's saying.
Want to jump in here and re-invite the viewers to phone in with their questions and comments for our guest, Tim Sharrock of the Journal of Commerce. He's been following this issue and reports on international trade and labor. He's been there for 5 years. Who are the Teamsters? What is the recent history, and how many members? Give us a bio on all that.
The Teamsters is the largest industrial union in the United States, one of the largest unions in the world. They have 1.4 members. They represent about 10% of the AFL-CIO, and they represent primarily truckers, but they're in many industries. Flight attendants belong to the Teamsters Union. For years and years, their name was synonymous with corruption. In fact, there was a lot of organized crime, domination of union locals. There was organized crime all the way to the top level here in Washington. And anybody who's seen the movie Casino knows how the pension funds were drained to build casinos in Las Vegas and so on. And there was all kinds of nepotism, and it was an ugly, ugly scene. And frankly, it gave labor a terrible name in the United States. And Ron Kerry led a campaign based on grassroots people that wanted to fight the corruption and end the nepotism. And 5 years ago, when he won, I think it was a real turning point in the American labor movement, because what happened with the Teamsters happened. There wasn't as much corruption in the AFL-CIO, but there was a lot of unrest within the AFL-CIO, and it was kind of a precursor to what happened later on. And I think under Kerry, he's hired all kinds of innovative people who've taken used new kind of techniques to organize and also to fight employers with varying degrees of success, as I mentioned before.
Before we go to the phone calls, put this in the broader perspective in terms of the future and the strength of labor. Why would our viewers, why might they, or why should they be interested in this if they're not natural?
Well, anybody who's been paying attention to national politics knows that organized labor has, in the last couple of years, become a much stronger political force than it's been for almost a generation. And this is because of rank and file movement within organized labor, and a very big change at the top, which resulted about a year ago in the election of John Sweeney to be president of the AFL-CIO. He was one of a group of union leaders who tried to force out the former president, Lane Kirkland, saying that unions were losing too many members and labor had to be more aggressive. The Teamsters under Mr. Kerry played a key role in this election in getting, toppling Mr. Kirkland. And Kerry was a very strong ally of Mr. Sweeney, and so any American interested in the economy, interested in politics, should know that labor's here in much stronger than it's been in the past. The Teamsters have been an important part of that. This election will have an impact on what the AFL-CIO does.
Get some calls in. Mobile, Alabama. You're our first call. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. How you gentlemen doing?
Good.
My question is to both of you all. What do y'all think the future of the union is going to be, and the significance of the union in this country? And that's about it. I want to know what do y'all think the union represent nowadays, and what is the future of the union? And do we need a union?
Are you talking about the Teamsters here, or just union in general?
I'm a union brother myself, and the union have done a lot for me. They enabled me to get an education. And it's very important, and the union is painted like, everything got a little something wrong with it, and we can all improve. But I just want to know from you all this morning, and give the people this insight, what do y'all think the union future is, and what do the union hold for its workers and this country?
All right, caller.
Well, the unions are trying to organize and trying to expand their membership, and I think they're definitely going into politics in a much broader way than they did before. And I think there's a growing, all the unions have lost a lot of members in the last 30 years or so, due to a lot of factors, including the whole change in the economy, which hit hardest industries where unions are very strong and powerful, like the steel industry, for example. But now more and more people in the new industries, service industries, farm workers, strawberry workers, for example, are organizing, seeing the need for unions, university professors. And I think at times when employers are trying to cut back, trying to go to a situation where you have more part-time workers, where you have less full-time, and trying to cut back on benefits, that people go to see unions as an organization that can protect their interests and expand their protections.
Let's go to Hampstead, Maryland. Good morning to you.
Good morning. I just wanted to ask the question: why is it people support President Clinton, or the unions, or the Teamsters? Why do they support President Clinton when he voted for NAFTA and GATT? Why is that? I mean, because they were like dead set against that, but yet you know, they get behind President Clinton. They think he's wonderful, but yet, to me, he stabbed them in the back. I mean, that's the way I look at it.
Well, I think since we're talking about the Teamsters, I think it's important to mention here that the Teamsters, particularly Mr. Kerry, is one of the strongest opponents of NAFTA, spoke out often and vociferously, and was a key spokesperson for the coalition against NAFTA, and that hasn't stopped. The Teamsters are still very vocal about trying to stop Mexican truckers from coming into this country, and they're certainly not going to. They're not going to stop that campaign, no matter who wins. Why, Labor, I think, in general, sees President Clinton. If you look at, if you look at Bob Dole wasn't any particular support of organized labor. They kind of made a pragmatic choice. I'm not telling you my opinion. I'm telling you sort of how they saw it. They made a pragmatic choice, and the choice was between a Republican who's no friend to organized labor to a Democrat who may have stabbed him in the back, as you say, on free trade, but nevertheless supports the right of unions to organize, has made some appointments to the National Labor Relations Board, other organizations that labor has appreciated.
In the Teamsters election that they're counting the ballots for now, does President Clinton or congressional leaders have a preference? Do they need to have a preference between those two?
No, and I think anybody trying to step in this is stepping in a minefield, because this election is very, very close. It's, both sides say it's too close to call. We're not going to really know the results until Thursday or Friday, and it would be a real mistake for anybody to take sides at this point, because they know how volatile that could be when you have a lot of members, on one side or the other. And the same goes for the trucking industry too. I mean, you won't find any trucking person say, well, we'd rather have Kerry or we'd rather have Hoffa.
We mentioned that there's 1.4 million members. That's how many ballots were mailed out, but about 500,000 have come back. Does that number surprise you?
Well, it's bigger than in the last election. They had about 400,000 ballots. We're talking 5 years ago, and that was at a time when the union had 100,000 more members. So, but the fact that you have 500,000 votes right now shows you that there's a lot of interest, and I'm not surprised because of the heated nature of this campaign and the issues at stake here.
Let's go to Boston. Good morning.
Hi, Tim.
Yes.
Hi. I am real familiar with the Journal of Commerce because of the fact that I belong to National Maritime Union, and I hope you don't hold that against me.
Absolutely not. I've covered your union quite closely, as a matter of fact.
I appreciate it, too, because you're a primary source of information about my union. We can't find out through our union newspapers or our own officials, but I'm looking at this election as being very important because of the fact that there are so many people that perceive unions to be corrupt, and that's a questionable. We can talk about that another time, I think. But what's important is that we have to have leaders that aren't corruptible, and I think that if Hoffa gets elected, I think the guys that are voting for him are all crazy. I'm going. You have to have people that are that look like they're clean. If they're perceived by the average guy as coming from they're corrupt. They're going to be taking money into the table. It's going to turn recruiting in the unions. And right now, there's an article in the Boston Globe today about the deficit hitting a record $48 billion. I tied NAFTA, this all together to what's going on in our country as far as wages going down. And the unions are the only way that the average guy can really get a good wage. And what's going on right now is very, very important. And if I could ask you one question, Tim, have you heard anything about NMU and the president right now being in the grand jury?
Well, he was indicted. We're talking about the president of the National Maritime Union. His name is Louis Parisi. He was indicted on numerous counts of embezzlement, corruption during the summer, and he goes on trial in January in Philadelphia.
While we have you here, we mentioned President Clinton before. Weave this newspaper story, if you can, into the labor issue. Key group split over labor posts. This is Secretary of Labor Robert Reich. For weeks, White House Director of Public Liaison Alexis Herman has been named privately as the leading contender. But apparently there's some opposition from labor, according to this article.
Well, first of all, I think the fact that you have a front-page lead story in the Washington Post about the position of Secretary of Labor shows you that labor has reemerged as a political force in this country, point one. Point two, I've talked to some of the leadership of the AFL-CIO who they'd like to see replace Mr. Reich, and what they want is somebody who understands labor concerns, understands labor issues, and has the ear of the president. They had both of those in Mr. Reich. He was a key advisor to Clinton, primarily after the '94 election. Unions, and that's very rare. And I think what the split is about is whether he should appoint a White House liaison person or Harris Wofford, who's favored by organized labor.
Running a little short on time. We could squeeze one more call in. Flemington, New Jersey, if you could be brief, we're running short.
Hello? Hello? Yes, I just wanted to have a couple of points of contention. You said that Ron Kerry was a spokesman against NAFTA. When NAFTA was on, we really had no lobbyist in Washington. Then when he did hire a lobbyist, he didn't go to the Teamsters. He went to Planned Parenthood. This man, he's been in there for 5 years, and you talked about corruption. It is most people's contention that he is more corrupt than anybody because he has $2 million worth of UPS stock that was a gift to him from UPS. And this fella, he's up there. It's a very big conflict of interest. He should not be negotiating Teamster contracts when companies are out there giving him gifts for $2 million.
All right, final thought.
Well, I don't have any. I think I have not seen any evidence that he is corrupt, like you say. I think there's questions about his UPS stock. At the same time, I think the same goes for Mr. Hoffa. I think a key point here is no matter who wins, both sides are going to be against corruption. I believe Mr. Kerry has done. He's obviously the union is under a consent agreement with the government to crack down on corrupt locals, corrupt leaders, and Kerry has moved against many of them. Hoffa has said that he's doing some of this for political reasons, but I think the legacy of this is going to be a clean union no matter who wins.
We'll look to follow up when we hear the results of the election.
Okay.
Tim Shorrock of the Journal of Commerce, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you.
And we will be right back.
Later, a look at the issue of capital punishment on the rise again in the United States 20 years after it was reinstituted. We'll be joined by Richard Dieter of the Death Penalty Information Center and John Pemberton of the Washington Legal Fund. Next, we'll talk to David Frum, a senior fellow with the Manhattan Institute, and Christopher Hitchens, a contributing editor with Vanity Fair. But first, we'll go to North Carolina's 12th District with the C-SPAN school bus.
It's an interesting district because it's kind of a string bean district that's stretched out over about half of the state. But really, it has about 4 centers. It has about 4 very dense urban areas in Durham, Greensboro, Charlotte, and Gastonia. And those 4 areas are really just kind of hooked together with long, thin lines that essentially run along the interstate. And so what you've got are 4 essentially inner-city neighborhoods, about half African-American, about half white. But that's the kind of district it is. If you go to, say, downtown Durham or downtown Greensboro or Charlotte, you'll find the same kind of area with the same kinds of people, with about the same kind of income levels and so forth. And then those 4 areas are just kind of connected together. That's the kind of district it is. It's an inner city district. It's got problems of inadequate housing, of dilapidated housing, very severe crime problems, problems of unemployment, problems of youth delinquency. It's really a district that has many of the great urban problems in our country kind of concentrated within it. And it's interesting that in North Carolina, this is the only exclusively urban district. All of the other districts are part urban and part rural, because North Carolina now is about half rural and about half urban. But this district is all urban, except for the thin lines down the highways that stretch it together. That's really about all you can say about it demographically. But I do think you should keep in mind that some people think of this district as being a black district. It is not. It's only about half African American. So in many ways, this is the most integrated district in the state of North Carolina. Mel Watt is an African-American congressman. He used to be a member of the North Carolina Senate, and when he left the North Carolina Senate after 2 or 3 terms, I forget how many terms exactly, many people said that he was the conscience of the North Carolina Senate, because he was the one that reminded them up there that there were people who needed the help of government for various programs. And he was often voting in the North Carolina Senate all by himself against programs that he thought were wrong, or advocating programs that often didn't have much support. The North Carolina Senate is a pretty conservative body, and Mel Watt is very, very liberal. And you'll see that same effect to some extent in his behavior as a congressman. He makes no bones about being proud of being a liberal congressman, and he often votes against measures where he is one of only a handful of congressmen who will vote against those measures, or sometimes he's advocating something. Mel won the first time in, let's see, in 92, and then reelected in 94, and then reelected in 96. You see, the district was first created in 1992 as a result of the suggestion from the Justice Department that the state legislature had to create 2 districts which would give African Americans a reasonable opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. And this is one of those 2 minority opportunity districts, as they're called. Now, next April, according to the Supreme Court, the state legislature has to undraw those very same districts. And so what will happen is the 12th Congressional District will essentially dissolve, and they'll have to redraw this part of the state, essentially taking the various parts of it and combining it with other districts. What that will probably mean is that all those districts will have a very large majority of white voters, and that probably Mel Watt will be out of a job.
Today, one C-SPAN school bus travels from Frankfort, Kentucky to Lancaster, Ohio. The other bus is in Anaheim, California for a cable industry trade show. Washington Journal continues.
We have an hour here with 2 guests who are rejoining us here. We're going to talk with Christopher Hitchens of Vanity Fair. Good morning.
Morning.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
And we're going to talk with David Frum, an author and a member of the Manhattan Institute. Good morning to you.
Thank you.
What are you reading today?
Well, the first story that caught my eye was the story that was in both the Washington Post and the Washington Times. A team of Columbia University researchers has come up with some disturbing findings about the rising incidence of child poverty. This is one of these stories that is a profound trend in American life, but somehow never seems newsworthy enough to actually break through the usual noise of the broad trends. Here's what they found. The percentage of children in poverty is up sharply over the past 20 years, and numbers here are probably better than statistics. That in 1975 there were 3.5 million children living in poverty, and today there are 6 million children living in poverty. Now, what's striking, and the reason to look at both stories, is that the 2 newspapers implicitly give the Washington Post and the Washington Times different explanations of why this is so. And in a way,
this is the Times story we're looking at, by the way.
Okay. And in a way, it sort of sums up a lot of the ideological debate in America about what is going wrong with the country. The Washington Post story follows the Columbia researchers in believing that the main problem is the declining rate of pay. At least that's available to the less skilled, that it's more difficult for less skilled people to find work, so they are poor, and therefore their children are poor. The Washington Times story emphasizes that it's family status that has everything to do with it, that of the children who are poor, only 8% of poor children live with a married mother and father. 92% live either with parents who are living together common law, which is usually a very short-term arrangement, or in single-parent households. And so that you've got the statistical evidence, the facts right there, to come up with whichever view you like. Is that child poverty is a result of changes in the labor market? Child poverty is the result of changes in American family structure.
Christopher Hitchens, I'll give you a chance to respond to that, and you have a different interest this morning as well.
Got to be said that there's something superficially plausible about shortage of money as an explanation for poverty, though, I think. I mean, I've always felt, I mean, and given all the I won't give it its right name. All the nonsense talked about family values, or the incessant stress placed on them, it is still a pretty amazing reproach that the number of children living in absolute poverty should be going up in the way that it has done. In in Sweden a few years ago, the country I think probably most disliked by the American right, maybe even more than Cuba, I sometimes think, it was found that you could take a child out of a class in any school at random and run the ruler over it, its teeth, its skin, its calcium, rate of growth, and all that kind of thing. And having run the ruler over it, you could make no guess at all about the social class or occupation of its parents. That's what I would call a social democratic achievement. Imagine how far one is in America from being able to do that. You can tell more or less at a glance what the social class or origins of a lot of people are. Just a thought. I must say I don't think it's necessarily an antithesis what you put forward at the opening, because poverty is very often a cause of family breakup, as is joblessness among males. And I think that it may be a distinction without a difference to suggest that one is a cultural and one is a social cause of misery among our children.
Actually, but family breakup seems to be bigger. That there were 7.5 million children altogether born out of wedlock in the United States last year. Many of them to non-poor people. I agree with Christopher Hitchens. This is maybe one of the top 2 or 3 things that Americans should be worrying about. I mean, that a quarter of the country's children are growing up poor, and as Christopher Hitchens says, that means that they're never going to be as tall. That means they're never going to be as clever because they're not fed properly when they're young. I mean, it has huge implications for the society. And
they're not going to be very good parents either.
And they're not going to be very good parents.
Let's get some more issues and more articles on the table here, but first we want to re-invite the viewers to phone in with their questions, comments, anything they're seeing in their papers around the country. We'll put the split lines on the screen again for you. Talk for a couple more minutes and then start taking your phone calls. Our guests this morning are David Frum, who is the author of this book right here. It's titled What's Right? Came out earlier this year, right? How's it doing?
It's doing actually not too bad. I say that with sort of a pleasant surprise. I always expect that these things are going to vanish without a trace, but it seems to be selling in its niche reasonably briskly.
I prefer the title of the last one, I must say, which was, by the way, Dead Right.
That's right.
And Christopher,
which I always kept hoping would be more prescient than it actually was.
Now you, Christopher Hitchens, just got back from overseas.
I did.
Where were you, and why did you go?
Well, actually, it's not all that. Last week, just before Thanksgiving, I was in Cyprus, which I think is a very important subject, very much off the American radar screen at the moment, but I predict about to come back. The situation in Cyprus is deteriorating, I believe. The overall rivalry between Greece and Turkey is intensifying, but the situation in Cyprus itself is intensifying independently. The Turkish position is becoming much harder. They've just adopted what I would describe as a shoot-to-kill policy against people who protest against the Turkish partition of the island. 3 people were killed over the summer in cold blood as a result. And it's one of those stories that everyone feels they know and has been filed away on them. Actually, you can't file something on a back burner, can you? But you know what I mean. Has been stored and looked like a permanent petrified stalemate, but in fact the stalemate is becoming unstable, and so I went to have a look at that and try and update my book on the subject.
And you mentioned that it's sort of a small arms build-up among 2 NATO countries.
Yes, there's a local arms race going on, which should concern your viewers probably more than it does, in that the United States is the principal supplier of heavy weaponry to both sides. Both of the rivals in this case are members of the NATO alliance, and the United States, as the biggest exporter of military hardware around the world, is the armorer of both. In fact, it also ought to be better known, in my opinion, that Turkey violates the United States Foreign Assistance Act by using aid and military material given to it for its own defense for the occupation and colonization of northern Cyprus.
And we know you have an article that you brought to the table here out of Zaire this morning. What's on your mind?
Yes, sorry, still to keep people overseas, but another thing that surprises me, because it's a thing one could have seen coming at least a year ago, is the implosion of the Mobutu regime in Zaire. Probably the worst regime in probably the richest, potentially most successful country in Africa. And once again, very much United States responsibility. General Mobutu was imposed upon Zaire by the Central Intelligence Agency a long time ago. He and his army and his appalling regime are our business, and they've got a very short time now, I would say, to live or to survive. live in the case of Mobutu because he's dying of cancer, and survive in the case of the regime because it is a one-man despotism, and its army is trained only to fight its own civilians and is now gradually collapsing in the eastern provinces as the rebels get nearer the capital. If I was Mr. Anthony Lake, I would be calling urgent briefings at my new CIA to find out what went wrong and begin the inquest now.
Stay overseas just for a minute here. Actually, the Chinese defense minister was in town yesterday, made a speech, got a pretty decent amount of coverage, front page in the Washington Times here. This gentleman defended the 1989 attack on Tiananmen Square and actually claimed no one was killed in the bloody confrontation, as he points out here. Any response to what you've seen?
It's all a big misunderstanding. I have to say that I would, if I were a front page editor, I would not put Chinese, I would not regard Chinese communists thinks it's okay to kill people as a front page story. That strikes me as a dog bites man story. If you found a Chinese communist who thought it wasn't okay to kill people, that would be a front page story.
I'm amazed at the hold that the Chinese seem to be able to exert over Washington, and the way that this must be the third administration running that they've managed to humiliate, that's come into office saying, look, we really do intend to make human rights a priority in our China policy, and then has reversed itself. Now we have to, apparently this guy got quite a sort of warm reception wherever he spoke too, was treated, you know, as an honored guest. I think it's a bit much.
He was, according to this article, shunned by most Republican members of Congress, though, during a breakfast reception on Capitol Hill that was
Well, that's
attended
probably
mostly
because
by
it's the Democrats' turn to be groveling to China. It would have been the other way around if it had been the Bush administration.
What else are you reading?
The Republican Party won control of the Texas State Senate for the first time since Reconstruction. That's a story on page 2 of this morning's Washington Post. I think it's in the Washington Times as well.
Got the Times story here.
This is big news. Governor George Bush in Texas is planning a run for the presidency in the year 2000, as I understand. I don't think it's generally understood how weak the Texas governor is. He's one of the weakest governors in America. There's very little that he can actually do to, the lieutenant governor turns out to be actually a more powerful person in many ways than the governor. But Texas is a state run by its legislature, and the Democratic Party has managed to stave off defeat in Texas for a long time. I think the tide has now turned. It is a reminder of how epiphenomenal the whole Clinton presidency is. That the Clinton presidency, from the Democratic point of view, is sort of like getting your teeth capped while your gums are rotting. That the top of the ticket is still there, there's still a Democratic Party on top, but all the way down, that the Democratic Party is decomposing before our eyes. There's a lot of optimistic talk among Democrats at the time of the election. Christopher Hitchens, I guess you'd call him corporate colleague, Sidney Blumenthal, who writes for the New Yorker, a sister publication of Vanity Fair, suggested that the story here is that the Republican Party is disintegrating, and that we've now got this new Democratic coalition. In fact, this is evidence of the underlying strength of the Republican Party and the underlying weakness of the Democrats.
I like the idea of being a corporate colleague of Sidney's, and I'm a great fan of his, but I must say that I'm inclined to agree with you that the success of Clinton depends more or less on the defeat of his party, that he more or less explicitly campaigned for Clinton-Gingrich 92, and that's of course what he got, but he didn't campaign at all to try and get the Democratic control of Congress back, didn't mention it in his convention speech, didn't mention it on the campaign trail. Really, I think, had internalized the idea that he owed his recovery as a president to the defeat of his party by Gingrich in 94. And the Texas thing may not be the symptom of that you suggest, but there's nothing wrong with your underlying analysis. The Texas thing could also be, I suppose, taken as a symptom of something else that's long-term, the southernization of the GOP.
The president will be speaking to his party, or at least a section of the party today, about 12:15. We'll have the speech here on C-SPAN to the Democratic Leadership Council. It's a group that he once headed. Gerald Seib in the Wall Street Journal today. This will be the most serious policy speech Mr. Clinton gives between his election and his inauguration, so it bears watching for signs of what is to come in the next 4 years.
The DLC is the living refutation of all those who believe that Clinton is a closet liberal. I mean, he began his political career helping to found an organization that wanted to move the Democratic Party to the right. And he's now moved not just the party but the entire country to the right in a way that probably no Republican could have managed in such a short time. So they'll have lots to talk about when they get together.
Well, he sort of has this strange, almost sick relationship with the right wing of his party. He returns to them periodically for strength, and then he forgets about them and drifts away. And that he will periodically make these trips of contrition and reunification with the DLC. That he had a big meeting with them after the 1994 election. I think that was his first big speech, was to the DLC again. Then he forgot about them for a while, and now he's been reelected. Now he returns, I think that they're like, I mean, it's like some Victorian saga about the mother of a bad boy, and he always shows up when he's in trouble on mother's steps, weeping and wailing, and she takes him in and gives him a meal, and then he's off again back to the saloons. And I think that is, I wouldn't say that President Clinton is a liberal. On the other hand, I think it's exactly the same kind of mistake to say that he's a right-wing Democrat as it is to say that he's a left-wing Democrat.
Can't think what saloons you're talking about.
Oh, the flesh pots of liberalism.
Go on.
Yes. Well, I mean,
what would be his most conspicuous recent visit there, would you say?
Well,
I mean, I do know what you mean by saloons and flesh pots, but
well, for example, he gave his a big black tie address to the DLC after the 1994 election, in which he said he would be a good boy and not indulge in irresponsible politics, and do the kinds of things they believed in. The thing they probably believe in more than anything else is getting control of the budget, making sure that bring the entitlements problem under control, and getting America's long-term fiscal balance in order. What Clinton then spent the next 18 months doing was fighting the Medicare battle in a way that is going to make it immensely more difficult to achieve any of the reforms that the DLC believes in, and that he has won the presidency on a slogan, no changes to Medicare. Well, there are going to be changes in Medicare. There must be changes in Medicare, and DLC people believe that more than anybody, and yet he himself, by the way he fought his election campaign, the way he outmaneuvered the Republicans in the last Congress, has made it extraordinarily difficult to achieve that. Now he's there for absolution and is promising that in his second term he is going to do exactly what he promised not to do in the last 18 months of his first term.
And the reversal on the balanced budget amendment must be worth any number of what anyone understands to be election-year remarks about Medicare. Well, if you're totting up ideological evolution, I think it is.
Headline in the Wall Street Journal concerning balanced budget, as Mr. Hitchens pointed out, balanced budget amendment is up for grabs over on Capitol Hill, in House at least, while support strengthens in the Senate. We've got a lot more we want to bring to the table, but we do want to get some of the viewers involved here. Our first call for David Frum and Chris Hitchens, Dover, Delaware. Thanks for hanging on. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi.
Yeah, good morning. I'd like to make a couple comments. One is that I've worked in the hospitals for almost 20 years. I'm an anesthetist, and I've participated in abortions, and as far as giving anesthesia for individuals who needed them. I've never seen one partial birth abortion in 20 years. I've seen instances where the gynecologist has made a wrong determination, and the lady is later on in the birth, than we realized, and they've used saline injections, generally speaking, to deliver these babies that are, closer to full term. But the only time I've ever seen a baby dissected was when they thought that the child was much earlier than he was, and they'd already started the abortion procedure, and they had to remove it then because it was already dead. That's the one thing. The other thing is that the abortion rights people would spend more time trying to help the living children who need help. As you've indicated earlier, the number of poor children in this country is increasing. No one seems to care about them. They're worried about children who are not even here. So let's take care of what we have right here, and maybe we can deal with this other problem later.
All right, Paul.
I'm willing to take that as a comment. It didn't seem to be a question.
Yeah, I'll just throw this one thought out. I don't think it's true that that not enough abortions is the reason that there are more and more children living in poverty. And even if it were, I don't think it would be I don't think that it would be the best solution to the problem of the increase of the number of children in poverty to recommend aborting more of them.
Let's go to Potomac, Maryland, our next call. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi.
I'd just like to ask two questions, actually. Does the Republican gentleman there, does he support the Chinese actions right now with the different things that's going on in China?
Well, I'm not if that's directed to me, I'm not really much of a Republican. I don't know how the caller would think that that the actions of the Chinese Communist government are in some way or other the fault or the responsibility of the Republican Party.
Caller, you want to respond to that? You still there?
Yes. I didn't quite get the last piece of my answer. What? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, the Republican Party is the Republican Party is the ideologically anti-communist party that is always being attacked for its, in fact, inflexible and rigid attitude on questions like communism. So I don't know that. I don't know that there are very many Republicans who would endorse the actions of the Chinese government.
Well, I guess I really didn't ask the right question. What I really had in my head was the one-child policy that they have in China.
Okay, we understand, caller.
Which is a very fascinating policy, because if you think about it, it means that in a generation or so there would be no realistic word for brother or sister, which would be a very odd thing for a communist society to find that it had created. Not to mention the thought of a society of 1 billion people all made up of only children. By the way, talking of that, you see that Freud's come back in Russia. Lenin was very keen on Freud, and started after the Bolshevik Revolution to encourage psychoanalysis among Soviet citizens. Stalin thought that it was bad and no doubt had Oedipal reasons of his own for repressing it, completely banning it, and now it's been legalized again, psychoanalysis in Russia. But they're going to need it in China if they have 1 billion only children and not just no word for brother and sister, but no word for aunt or uncle quite soon. So the fraternity bit of liberty, equality, and fraternity will be down the tubes.
What else you got your eye on today?
One other thing. In that same front page below the fold, the merger of St. Luke's, I guess it isn't below the fold, of St. Luke's and Beth Israel Hospital in New York.
It is.
Again, this is more of a trend story than a big news story, but it's an example of how, since 1993, and amazingly enough, coinciding with the defeat of the so-called Clinton reform, that American medicine through the marketplace has completely reinvented itself. Now, a lot of the reinvention has been experimental and innovative, and there have been a lot of disappointments and failures along the way. But in fact, exactly the problem that President Clinton campaigned in 1992 on, and saying that only government could solve, that is, the rise in medical costs and the shrinkage of the number of people covered by private health insurance, is in its sort of crude, lumbering, often brutal way being directly handled by the American marketplace. That costs have come down. The rate of medical inflation has fallen to below 4% over the past 3 years. Americans are switching from traditional medicine to HMOs. As a result, the number of people who are losing their coverage is being stabilized. And stories like this are just give us periodic glimpses of a marketplace that is being reinvented in a creative way. And it warns us that just as we now see that the 1993 Clinton health plan would have aborted a lot of these important changes, that we have to be very wary of what the president plans in his second term. He again plans to monkey, this time in a more cynical and opportunistic and less coherent way than in the first term with the American healthcare marketplace. And again, this should be stopped. There are always going to be horror stories when you have a marketplace that is churning and reinventing itself as rapidly as this one. But on the whole, this is a story of tremendous creativity and dynamism, and it should not be interfered with.
Any thoughts?
You're Canadian, aren't you? Are you a refugee from the single payer? Do you consider yourself to be?
The summary line on the Canadian health care system is Canada is a great place to be when you're not sick. That if you twist your ankle, I'd much rather twist my ankle in Toronto than in Washington. I go to a hospital, the doctor looks at me, I come out again, no paperwork, no forms to fill out. If, however, I'm sick, if I need an MRI, if I need a CAT scan, if I need a world-level surgeon, I would much rather be in the United States than in Canada. That for all its bureaucracy and inefficiencies and inconveniences, the American system does do a better job of providing high technological medicine than the Canadian. There are more, I think there are more CAT scan machines in metropolitan Washington than in all of Canada.
Well, the United States is a richer country too, but I mean, as someone who was brought up in, I can't believe that one couldn't close the technical gap without compromising the principle of healthcare. I mean, I think it's just extraordinary that this country and South Africa are the only countries that can be described as advanced, which don't have a national health provision of some kind or another. And my experiences with it here seem to have persuaded me, at any rate, they combine the worst of capitalism with the worst of socialism. I mean, you can turn up, and if you haven't got a Visa card on you, they'll send you away. But the amount of paperwork and bureaucracy and paper shuffling and duplication of work that's involved in doing it is absolutely terrifying and would disgrace a Stalinist banana republic. And yet it's all for profit.
How's that compared to England, by the way?
Britain has a national health. Health treatment is a right in Britain. And it's the one thing of the one aspect, the one achievement, I should better say, of the post-war Labour government that not even Mrs. Thatcher dared to touch.
I don't know about the British situation. The way I would compare the United States and Canada is in Canada, we have these immense queues for all kinds of important operations. Everyone has insurance in Canada, but not everybody gets care. In the United States, it turns out almost everybody gets care, although many people lack insurance. So there's a choice. I won't defend the American system. It's obviously, it does combine the worst of both. It's also, by the way, a system in which the government looms very large. That's the cause of a lot of the problems. The federal government is the single largest purchaser of health care in the United States. But as this story shows, that the private market has tremendous creative potential in the United States, and it should be let free.
Well, the private market certainly knows how to do mergers, but I felt I knew that already.
About a half hour left with David Frum and Chris Hitchens. Aurora, Illinois, you've been hanging on. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Hitchens. Two quick questions, then my point. Can you give me your opinion of the De Leon-inspired Socialist Labor Party? Number two, you recall earlier in the year the SEC investigated the NASDAQ market makers for corruption. I was hoping you or your friend over at Counterpoint, Alexander Comerford, could look into the market makers equivalent on the New York Stock Exchange, the specialists. I've heard they are deeply corrupt and have massive conflicts of interest. Now, there is a wonderful article in the newest edition of the Progressive magazine by Elaine Rapping called Burrowing Within that addresses the cult of individualism. I spoke with you once and suggested that far more of a threat than the religious right is the Ayn Rand-inspired libertarian right. What makes them so insidious is that under the guise of self-help and therapy, they spread their deeply ideological pro-corporate message consisting chiefly of the lie that life is what you make it, when anyone who's ever had a Walmart or McDonald's come to town or worked inside these fascist multinationals knows the opposite is true, that life under capitalism is what corporations make it. And Mr. Frum, I would have to say that the government of China is about as communist as Pat Robertson is a Christian. Thank you.
There's a lot out there. Go ahead and react.
There's a very high standard of call for this time of the morning. I mean, not, but I think the opening bit is a little arcane for some people. Daniel De Leon was a great American socialist, rather dogmatic, rather schematic, thought by some, who ran for president on the Socialist Labour ticket, and founded a party which still bears that name, which still produces a socialist weekly called, I believe, The People. James Connolly, the great Irish Republican socialist revolutionary who was murdered by the British after the Easter Rising, got his early training in Daniel De Leon's party. Let me see. On the NASDAQ, I'll have to pass. I'm sorry, I just don't know enough about the SEC and NASDAQ, and I missed that story. As for what you ask about Ayn Rand and her influence on the American right, I think it's extremely interesting. There is a strain of, I'm sure a lot of people watching this have read either Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead, and perhaps imbibed some of the Randian doctrine, which is best summarized, I think, in her book, The Virtue of Selfishness. I've always thought it quaint and rather touching that there is in America a movement that thinks that people are not yet selfish enough. And I've met some of its supporters. They call themselves objectivists. And I've debated with them, but I've never got to the bottom of that problem. They think that really America is a society already rotten with too much socialism and compassion. And it's just so refreshing to meet people who manage to get through their day actually believing that.
The discussion here is getting very broad in terms of issues. What do you folks look for when you pick up the paper in the morning?
What do I look for?
Yeah.
I look for the style section, actually. It's always kind of a fight to get hold of it. I'm ashamed to admit that.
No, I became a journalist because I didn't want to have to rely on the newspapers for information. And I can't imagine what it's like for people who only do get their information that way. I mean, I get all my information, I think, from talking to other people in Washington. I read it basically for entertainment. And I follow the op-ed pages pretty closely, too.
The reason I asked the question is because there's a story about what's hot on the radio. We covered an event by Talkers Magazine yesterday. I wanted to compare your top 10 to this top 10. These are what radio talk show hosts say are the 10 hottest topics. We'll go right down the list and have you add or subtract from your own list. Presidential and local elections, quote, scandal gates of several varieties, crash of TWA Flight 800, Olympic bombing, the value jet crash, Unabomber, life on Mars, the Army sex scandal, the O.J. Simpson trial, and Texaco's racial problems. Whoops. Compare and contrast there to your list in terms of interest.
A half a dozen of them, or about half of them, I can't imagine what there is. I can't imagine what there is to say about the value jet crash, for example, that would fill up time on the radio. That it's a terrible thing. But I think that unless it's part of some kind of conspiracy worldview, like as I think has happened to the TWA.
No, surely it's to do with the fact that people on the staff of ValueJet were warning us before this crash that there were terrible corners being cut. Wouldn't that be the thing?
Well, I don't know what I don't know what the
corners being cut. I mean, maintenance corners being cut.
Yeah, I don't know if that's exactly why it is that this is so exciting to the people on talk radio.
I would move life on Mars much higher up the list.
Number one? Not quite?
Well, over some local elections I would. Yeah, actually, no, I think it's... I read a book once by a man I do look for in the paper is John Noble Wilford, the science writer of the Times, the New York Times, who wrote a wonderful book called Mars Beckons about the possibility, not that there is life on Mars, but that life could be created there, that the conditions for it exist, and that by seeding Mars... Do I look like a complete crackpot when I'm saying that? That by seeding Mars with nitrous oxide and so on, you could create clouds which would one day create rain, which would one day create life. This is a real possibility, apparently. Absolutely enthralling work. That one could organize a genesis moment for Mars and then stand back.
I hope Wilford doesn't talk to his economic colleagues at the New York Times about this, because they'd be worried about what this would mean for the trade deficit.
And I was also, I must say, I was kind of thrilled to find that there may be water on the moon, after all. Or at least ice, therefore possibly water. Because it means we won't have to take any there. And that possibly something of a similar process could be inaugurated up there, too.
Let's get some more calls in Bel Air, Maryland. You're next. Bel Air, go ahead.
Good morning.
Morning.
My question is, or my comments are for Mr. Frum, who seemed to have some nasty things to say about the Canadian health care. I recently attended a wedding in Connecticut, and most of the guests were from Canada. And while they were there, the mother of one of the guests had fallen and broken a hip. Now, the extent of the medical care in Canada is such that this woman didn't even feel compelled to run home. There was instant medical care and home care available to her. So I'd also like to point out recently, a couple of years ago, Mr. Tsongas, ex-Senator Tsongas, made a comment that if he'd had his condition, which required bone marrow transplant, in Canada he would have died. I think he failed to mention that the procedure for bone marrow transplant was perfected in Canada. And there was nobody there at that wedding. I took that occasion to bring up the state of medical care in Canada, and everybody raved about it. I would also point out to Mr. Frum that his comment about the horrors of some of the abuses in our own system are not as anecdotal as you would seem to imply. 8,000 women were sent home the same day having a mastectomy. To me, that is not a minor horror story.
Mr. Frum?
Granted, it was a small percentage of the women, but that it should happen at all. I would also bring up the drive-by delivery situation.
Well,
Caller, let's get a response.
Well, I think that the drive-by delivery is sort of an unfortunate, actually, comparison, because drive-by deliveries are now the rule in Canada, that everybody in Canada, unless you have an extreme condition, is sent home within 24 hours. Also, the babies are left in the room. They close in at least in most of the Toronto hospitals. I think this is the case in the poorer parts of Canada. They've closed the incubators, except for the high-risk babies. You get the baby right away because there isn't money for nurses. I mean, it's true about Canadian medical research. I mean, there are a lot of brilliant people working in Canadian universities. But the Canadian medical situation is exactly what you would expect it to be in a society where you pay, an English-speaking society adjacent to the United States, where doctors are paid, and the more skilled they are, the more true this is, something between a third and one-half what their American counterparts are paid, in which the only check on patients don't see a bill, so the only check on their use of the system is top-down administrative controls, and in which governments try to control costs by reducing the amount of technology in the system. It behaves exactly the way you would expect it to behave.
Lafayette, Louisiana, you're next.
Hello.
Hi.
Yes, I'd like to talk to Mr. Hitchens about the national health care in Britain. I don't know how you think it's wonderful. I'll just give you one example. My sister needed surgery for a hernia. It took 2 years before they finally admitted her. And if she couldn't have gone that day when they called, she would have to go on the list again, on the waiting list. They finally did the surgery on her. She was in terrible pain. They did what they called keyhole surgery over there. After 6 hours, she was still in surgery. He had to open her up and go in. And what he did was he ruptured her spleen, and he had to take her spleen out. And now she's on antibiotics for the rest of her life. Now, if she was in this country, she would be a millionaire. And I don't believe in suing doctors. But this is just one example of the national health care in Britain. My father died because of the national health care in Britain. We all say, wonderful, the doctors come to your house. They came to the house twice in the middle of the night for my father and ignored it. And by the time the GP came in the morning after his quote surgery hours, he was sent to the hospital, died in the ambulance with an aneurysm. So don't tell me it's wonderful the doctors have house calls. It doesn't mean a damn thing.
All right, caller, tell us more about it.
I think I've said initially that it's the only one of British Labour's post-war institutional accomplishments that even Mrs. Thatcher felt she couldn't challenge. But that doesn't mean to say that the service hasn't become extremely run down and hasn't had grave cuts inflicted on it. And I've heard, actually I can't say I've heard a story as bad as the one that the lady just told us. It sounds absolutely frightful. But I've heard stories not dissimilar, and more of them recently, as the service has been allowed to fall into disrepair, but it still upholds the principle that healthcare is a right and is available to all. And that principle is imperfectly observed. Doesn't seem to me to be a criticism of what I said at the outset.
We have a call from Central South Carolina. What's on your mind?
Yes, I have a comment and a question for Chris Hitchens. Mr. Hitchens, I have heard that you are an atheist, and I was wondering if that was true, because I think you're much too intelligent to be an atheist, and you seem to have a really good heart, so I'm wondering why you don't believe in God. And I hope that you're not basing your concept of what Christianity is on the Pat Robertson model, because believe me, he does not speak for me, and I consider myself a born-again Christian, and he does and says a lot of things that are completely left field as far as I can tell. So I would encourage you to maybe look at a magazine like Sojourner. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there's that model too of Christianity, and I'm wondering if you've ever considered that and how that affects your faith or lack thereof, if at all.
All right, Colin.
Well, you seem to have a good heart too, ma'am. Though how you can tell about mine, I don't know. I would caution you not to judge a book by its cover. I have read Sojourners, and I've met the people who work there, and very nice they are too, but not even they will convince me that I owe my presence in this studio to a divine design. I don't believe I was divinely designed, nor do I believe I'm divinely supervised as I go about my daily tasks. I've decided that there's simply no reason to believe it, and so I don't.
I was rather looking forward to a conversion moment here on C-SPAN where Christopher Hitchens was going to...
It's blinded by the light. No, it's just, I just think that the whole hypothesis of us being created is now, I think that's very nearly, you can't, of course, totally disprove the existence of God. You can simply say there's no reason to believe in his or her existence. I think the idea of a divinity as the creator has now pretty much been, well, rendered unnecessary as an assumption. I mean, we have alternative explanations of how we got here, but it isn't really religious to say you believe that you're created. It's much more religious to say that you owe worship to someone who is supervising you and who takes an interest in your thoughts and your daily doings. I just find that quite impossible to believe and quite unnecessary to believe, and though it doesn't have to issue in superstition and bigotry and foolishness of the Pat Robertson kind, it makes a very good nursery for that sort of thing, because it's fundamentally solipsistic and narcissistic to believe that you are the adored object of a divinity.
Let's get Mr. Frum back in. Any other articles that you saw?
I think those were the big ones of the day. What seems to happen, I often wonder whether it's the supply of news that fluctuates or whether it's journalists' appetites for it. That I wonder whether, in fact, so many of the best journalists in America don't schedule holidays for the 2 weeks or 3 weeks immediately after an election, that you notice that your newspapers become very, very thin, and they become filled with stories like, I mean, with all due respect to Sigmund Freud, the front page story in the New York Times on the Russians rediscovering Freud, that had the feel of a story that was written maybe 3 months ago that was being saved for the day that all their political correspondents took their post-election holiday.
Would you classify this story in that category? We talked about this a little bit earlier.
No,
here.
This story is charming. This is really...
This is Dick Morris, the former aide to the president who left toward the end of the campaign there. He's pushing a book that he has out, and a picture here has him speaking to a class at NYU, New York University, in the city there, and he talks about his prescription for a comeback. 3 points. Number 1, apologize. You have to recognize your sins. Number 2, don't make excuses. And 3, consider yourself inoculated from further questions and criticism. And Susan Page writes that his comeback road is dauntingly uphill.
Well, that last sentence is much too optimistic. It isn't at all uphill. I mean, he's already back in the newspapers. No, I think he will be astonishingly easy. The essence of the Dick Morris method seems to be don't confuse the verbal formula of an apology with actual contrition. Because if you really were sorry, you wouldn't be able to help coming back to the subject again and again and again. But he seems to see it as a kind of like amulet. You say, I'm sorry, and that's it, the subject is closed. And then you tell the reporter from USA Today with 5 million readers, when they ask you a further question, the American people aren't interested in this. And you think, well, the people at USA Today must have some expertise in what the American people are interested in. They sell 5 million newspapers to them every day. But he is what Emerson called a representative man. I think he's just one of the most characteristic figures of our time, and he's fascinating.
New York Times following that story as well. Chris Hitchens, any reaction?
Comeback, I didn't think he'd even been away. I mean, by the way, he's another instance of what I mean about the president. I mean, this is a man who went from working for Jesse Helms to working for Clinton and designed his re-election strategy. So I think that really does lay the closet liberal thing to rest. More than that, though, this is the sort of person. I used, when I was at school, to be able to grow watercress on my sponge. It was a thing we were able to do at boarding school. If you let your sponge rot for long enough, you could grow watercress on it. In the absolute decay and debauchery of American politics and the takeover of it by soft money and spin doctoring, a certain kind of culture will grow in that grubby dish, and this type is the sort of thing we get. And he has more influence on the way elections are run and the way this president thinks than any 10 senators.
In his words, Dick Morris's words on President Clinton, we'll read the quote here, New York Times. What Clinton does is what any good sailor does. He tacks. The wind is blowing this way, so he goes toward the exit sign, but he goes like this way, and then it's blowing this way, so he shifts his sails and he goes that way. He's still working his way toward the exit sign, but he's not being an idiot about it. And then he goes a little this way and a little that way, and he ends up where he wants to go.
It's passes for political wisdom. It's just drivel. For one thing, there's no exit sign when you're sailing. I mean, people think, oh, what a masterly nautical metaphor. The guy's a complete idiot. But there's no such thing as disgrace anymore. There's no such thing as humiliation. There's no such thing as shame. All there is either celebrity or, at worst, notoriety. And this guy's the proof of it.
And about 20
makes you can hardly hold it down looking at a picture of that guy.
About 20 minutes left for the newspaper roundtable. Sarasota, Florida, you're next.
Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Couple things. One of them is we have people that make a conscious, fiscal responsible decision on how many children they should have. And they turn around and have to pay taxes for people that don't make that decision. There's also millions of people that want children that can't have them. Is there any thought to letting people that have the physical availability adopt children from people that can't afford them, that have them anyway?
David Frum?
Kind of a redistributive scheme of children. Not a subject I've given a lot of thought to, I have to say.
You touch on abortion in your book?
I don't think so. Not in that one. I touched on it a little bit in the first and talked about its impact on the Republican Party, and it's been big. And but I think that the people I take very seriously the views of people who are anti-abortion. I think that they are. I mean, they are often represented as you know, they get a very bad press. I mean, compared to other political minorities. But you know, I think that the question of child poverty and why they're poor children is a separate question, really, from fertility. Fertility rates in America have been declining steeply over the past 30 years. That the reason there are more poor children, the reason there are more abortions, is not because there are more children being born. In fact, there are many, many fewer children being born per woman than was the case 20 years ago. When America seemed to do better, or 20 or 30 years ago, when America seemed to do better by its more numerous, relatively more numerous children.
But I think our questioner was looking for an answer on adoption, not abortion, wasn't he? I mean, the tragic fact is that there are a lot of people who can't have children, and it must be awful for them. I often think, reading stories are all about abortion, thinking, oh, there are people who could have a child and don't want to. It increases their misery. I was the sponsor once of an adoption for a childless couple. You have to get people to say you're okay and you can pay the bills and so on, and they flattered me by asking me to be one of their sponsors. What amazed me was how much they were perfectly solvent and professional and responsible, and they met all the tests very easily, but they had the devil's own job getting hold of a child they could raise. And what struck me was how much this business is controlled by the churches. It's very, very hard to get hold of a child looking for a home unless you have some confessional way into doing it. And I can't believe that there couldn't be a better national adoption service method of matching people who want to give a child away to those who would love to make a home for one. I can't believe we can't do better than this.
Let's go to L.A. Got another call from there.
Hi, I wanted to draw your attention to a front-page story in the L.A. Times yesterday concerning Arizona's Prop 200, concerning the de facto legalization of a series of illicit drugs. Much of the attention has been focused on 215 in California, which was the Medical Marijuana Act. They're claiming in this article that the Arizona initiative is going to be a model for drug legalization throughout the entire United States. And since it was passed by 2 out of 3 Arizonans, as a similar number of Californians on a similar subject, I was wondering if the gentleman could comment.
Well,
Take it away.
I have to say I'm a heretic on this question. I think it makes a lot of sense, at least for the less serious drugs. You know, one of the things that I've always been given to understand about why the homicide rate in Washington, D.C. was so much higher than it is in almost any other American city, even cities with there are 350 homicides last year, which is considered a great achievement. It's down from 500 half a dozen years ago. Is that in Washington, the drug trade has always been completely disorganized. In New York and Philadelphia and Chicago, there are criminal syndicates, but still syndicates that understand who has control of the channels of drug distribution. In Washington, that's not been the case. You have these open-air drug markets. It's a very lucrative trade, and people get butchered over it. And I have to think it would be better for everybody if you took this trade out of the hands of criminal syndicates, put it into the hands of respectable companies that Democratic presidential candidates could demagogue against at election time, the evil tobacco marijuana complex, but ensure that it was regularized, that the level of profit in the industry came down, and that it wasn't worthwhile to butcher people over it. Yes, you would have a rise in addiction. I have no doubt about that. You'd have a fall in the murder rate. I think that would be a fair trade. That's a very heretical thought nowadays, but I think it would be a good trade.
I couldn't agree more. I'm very heartened to find that, in spite of all the incessant, ridiculous, hateful, self-evidently contradictory propaganda about the war on drugs, that when American voters are asked about it, it shows this propaganda has had no effect. It really cheers me up to think that. It restores one's faith in the thinking voter. I think decriminalization of drugs is long, long overdue. It will be looked back on when it is done as what was all that about? How did we let Richard Nixon declare a war on drugs and ruin so much of our society, throw away so many of our liberties, incarcerate so many innocent people, deny ourselves, in the case of marijuana, so many potential remedies? How did we ever let this prohibition go as far as it has gone? I would add to what David Frum says, that not just would there be a great decline in the murder rate, because I'm not threatened physically at all if someone in my building or on my block wants to put a substance into their system, which is their right and it's none of the government's business. That doesn't threaten me at all. What does threaten me is the people who will shoot at each other in the street for the right to sell him that stuff if it's illegal. The second thing that terrible consequence, fell consequence that arises from that is, of course, tremendous corruption. Whole police departments have been lost to the drug trade, you know, and I think it won't be long before there'll be judges too. It'll be much, much worse than Chicago in the 20s. And it already is pretty bad. I think that's the moment probably at which decriminalization will be considered forcibly by the authorities. They'll have to do something about it. But I think it's appalling one should have to wait that long.
Let's go out to Columbus, Ohio. Good morning.
Yes, I'm a first-time caller, and hopefully I won't get so nervous that I will sound like a blithering idiot here.
Welcome.
But I'm always struck by how poor the concept is of what it is to be poor. Having been there, and certainly all of my childhood, I was probably poorer than even the poorest in the inner city. I'm really struck by what people think that it really is like.
Well, let's get a definition from each of our guests. How do you define poor?
Yeah, I'm not sure I exactly understand the caller's question. I would define poverty as someone who, in a rural area, has a family income of less than $10,000, and in a city has a family income of less than $15,000.
Well, actually, that would have been very wealthy for the standard that I grew up in. And Mr. Hitchens particularly, when he said he didn't feel that they could grow up to be a good parent, etc., I want to say that it has nothing to do with money. It only has to do with character. And fortunately, even though if you took my childhood and put it on the scale, it would have met the very worst circumstances. But I had a mother who was very bright and who had character. And those are the concepts, more than money, that we really need.
The poor are different from us, as Scott Fitzgerald famously said. They have less money. I don't think you can, in fact, put a figure on it, because the definition must, I think, mean that if you're poor, it means you are not sure when your next meal is going to be, and you're not certain that you know where you're going to sleep, or you're not secure in your habitation. I think that's to be absolutely poor. Is to not have any confidence in the availability of the bare necessities. Of course it is true, as the lady says, for herself and by implication for others, that many people have triumphed over upbringings of that kind, and we know their stories. We partly know them, of course, because they're the survivors. There are people who didn't make it. And my point about people later on becoming poor parents, to use poor in another way, ma'am, was actually directed to what David Frum was saying about the relationship between poverty, malnutrition, and intelligence. I mean, it's been shown that children who are badly malnourished in their early days will have lower IQs, for example. So that doesn't, of course, a low IQ doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to be a good parent, but you know what I mean. The odds tend to lengthen at about that point.
Time to get in a couple more calls. Let's go to Buffalo first. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. A comment and a question. The comment relates to Mr. Frum and the Canadian healthcare system. I live up here in Buffalo, and it's about a 5-minute drive from Canada. And I would challenge Mr. Frum to come up with the name of one major Canadian politician who has suggested politically that they abandon the national health care system that he condemns so much for anything that we have down here. But my real question is this, perhaps for both gentlemen. Why does Mr. Clinton, who now has been reelected for 4 more years, can't run again, why can't he operate from the gut instead of continuing to have his finger up to the political wind to see which way it's blowing?
Well, I'll leave that second question to Christopher Hitchens, who probably has keener insights than I into the president's psychology. As to the first, why has no Canadian politician called for the abandonment of a system that is demonstrably now failing? Why does no American politician acknowledge that Social Security is in danger of going bankrupt? I mean, there are things that the mere fact that something is true doesn't mean that it is safe politically to say. And in Canada, the 2 things. One is that the problems of the healthcare system have been intensifying over the past half-dozen years. It actually did work, although the inevitability of some kind of crisis was there from the beginning. It worked reasonably well until 6 or 7 years ago. It's begun to go wrong since then. And second, that for Canadians, of course, as the caller in Buffalo will know, the healthcare system has significance way, way beyond whether it's doing a good job or not. It's an important touchstone of national identity. And at this point, to acknowledge in Canada that the healthcare system is false, it is the equivalent in the United States of acknowledging that the flag could be more beautiful. It's just something you don't say.
Give you a chance for one more comment. You mentioned, we've been talking about the president. You mentioned soft money earlier and campaign. One story we didn't get to bring up, but we'll bring up real quick here, is the White House is considering whether to open fundraisers attended by the president to the news media as a response to the public furor over questionable campaign money. They talk about potential...
How much do they have to pay to attend?
Well, they talk about potential problems with the dynamics of those meetings.
Well, that drives me wild with annoyance, because during the actual election campaign, when it would have been worth knowing and worth attending, I couldn't even get the Democratic National Committee to tell me which fundraisers the president had already attended. They considered that to be their private business, as indeed it was. But if I'd rung up and offered them money, they would have given me a straight answer and perhaps an invitation. But if I didn't have any money, they weren't interested. The franchising of politics and the sort of people to whom it's been franchised, like these real sweeties in Indonesia, is the scandal of the moment. And the scandal, as my friend Mike Kinsley once put it so well in Washington, is never what's illegal. The scandal is what's legal.
Last thought?
I am amused by the, I mean, there's the Dick Morris rule again. We asked, did he make a comeback? There it is. You issue your pro forma apology and then refuse ever again to acknowledge that anything went wrong. And then change the subject and say what we now need, of course, is a vast new regulatory statute.
It's always great to hear from both of you, David Frum from the Manhattan Institute and Christopher Hitchens of Vanity Fair. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
And we'll be back in a couple minutes.
Later, a look at capital punishment. We'll be joined by Richard Dieter of the Death Penalty Information Center and John Pemberton of the Washington Legal Fund. Next, we'll take your phone calls and comments on our daybook. But first, White House spokesman Mike McCurry's press briefing from yesterday.
It's on Hope and History Air, Sunday,
December 15th, 8 p.m. on C-SPAN. Tune in.
C-SPAN, that award-winning carrier of all vital things public, including the daily White House briefing. Yes, sir.
Speaking of television, what about the ratings?
Ratings, we have a dialogue underway with representatives of the industry, and that continues, and so does the work on these measures. Remember, it'll be about 1 year, I am told, before the V-chip itself will find its way into television sets at home, and parents can use it to help create the type of family entertainment environment they want for families. And that's a period of time in which we can work through a lot of issues related to ratings, and we will continue an active dialogue with members of the industry that we've had so far. But some of the reports of the way the ratings might be unfolding, we do not take as the last word from the industry on its views on those matters.
So in other words, you want to convince them to toughen it up?
We want to continue to have the very fruitful dialogue we're having with them.
On 209, I may not have understood properly the answer to one of the previous questions.
It was ambiguous.
Are you ruling out any kind of a court action entering the case with an amicus brief or as an intervener?
No, I'm not ruling it in or out. I'm saying the issue is still being looked at.
If the deadline is supposed to say, will you announce it here if you decide, if the administration decides to intervene, or will that come from justice only?
A good question. I don't know the answer. Normally, normally what would happen, that we would file the amicus brief and then we would talk about it after it had been filed. So I guess it would be filed as a court document, but I can check on that. Looks like we're dealing with that tomorrow in any event. Yeah.
The new trade figures are out. Could you sort of give us your take on it?
Well, I have nothing on it, but I'll make something up. My understanding, looking, it's a quarterly report that reflects two things. There's still continued strength in exports. We are selling more abroad, which is good news. The bad news is the strength of the American economy, rising incomes for many Americans are encouraging them to buy more from abroad. So we have an imbalance between imports and exports, but we believe one part of the cause of the imbalance is the strength of the American economy, the confidence of the American consumer, and they're buying. And they're buying in many cases from abroad. But the Commerce Department has talked at greater length and more knowledgibly on that subject. Yes.
Mike?
Yes, sir.
Pretty good. Mike, any comment on the fact that some Republicans on the Hill dissed any comment on the fact that some Republicans on the Hill dissed the Chinese defense minister today?
Well, they have made clear their views on that matter. They share concerns that we have on the subject of human rights, but we've made clear our reasons for having a broad engagement, including the military-to-military contact that includes the visit by the Chinese defense minister to the United States. Yes, ma'am.
On Proposition 209, if a bill is reintroduced by Congressman Kennedy to put that or extend that on the federal level, would the administration oppose it?
Well, the president opposed the proposition itself, and any position he would take on pending legislation would be consistent with his view that that is not the proper way to mend affirmative action as opposed to ending it altogether.
Washington Journal continues.
We are going to use the next 20 minutes or so, 15 or 20 minutes or so, to hear from you a little bit more about your newspaper articles around the country, and we'll take some of your calls in just a couple minutes here. First, I want to remind you about President Clinton's speech at about 12:15 p.m. Eastern Time today. It's going to be on either C-SPAN or C-SPAN 2, depending on a hearing that we're running on C-SPAN. So if it is 12:15 and our hearing is still going on, it's on the intelligence community, we are going to put that speech on C-SPAN 2, and we'll have a taped version tonight for you. Gerald Seib in the Wall Street Journal today, in the Capital Journal part of the newspaper, talks about what he sees this speech being the most serious policy speech Mr. Clinton gives between his election and his inauguration, so it bears watching for signs of what is to come over the next 4 years. So again, that speech is a little bit later today. We'll have some more articles that we'll show you, but we have some calls coming in now. Fort Lauderdale, Florida, our first one. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning, sir. My article is on the switching around the consumer price index. And I want to comment about your show yesterday. You had on the CPI, but my basic stance on the CPI is that our executive and legislative branch should put a new low on women and children first, then the old and feeble second, where they're trying to balance the budget on these guys' backs, but they need a balanced budget amendment. You know, they just can't do the work. You had some expert on there yesterday talking about, well, the homes are bigger than they are nowadays. Go out on any construction site and try to find a real 2x4. They're down to 1 7/8, 1.5 by 3.5 or 3 5/8. So in other words, you're taking a loaf of bread, you're used to inch slices, now you're cutting them at 3/4 inch slices and say, well, look, you're much better off. He talked about the cars being in so much better shape. When I was a teenager, I was down at my local beach. I couldn't afford a update car, so I bought an old Oldsmobile 88. I happened to be not keeping my eyes on the road, and I was staring at a couple young girls and ran that car into a retaining wall, got out, took a look at it. There was nothing wrong with it. He didn't even dent the fender. Take a modern car and run it into anything, and the thing will crumple up. No matter what to say, to get a car worked on nowadays, you have to be an expert mechanic, and you have to pay $50 an hour to have that done. Where it used to be, if some kid paid attention in his high school shop class and had a screwdriver and a wrench, he could work on his own car. Now it's 16 valves, dual overhead cams. That makes the car better.
All right, caller. Let's get another call on this one from Fort Wayne, Indiana. Go ahead.
Good morning.
Good morning.
In the Journal-Gazette here, there's a article, criminals were on Democrats' guest list. Drive to raise a record 120 million had its risks. And I find it a little interesting that it's starting to make more and more of an issue, even though the campaign is already over.
All right, caller. Shot of the U.S. Capitol there, live picture. It's less than a month to go now before the start of the 105th Congress, the House and Senate, and one of the stories we've been following were some runoff elections taking place down in Texas. We previewed those yesterday in the Washington Journal. Here are the results as they're reported. Representative Steve Stockman, a Republican, has lost in his special election down there to a Democrat by the name of Nick Lamson. It was 54 to 46% with 88% reporting. Democrat Ken Benson has won re-election according to this story, and State Representative Kevin Brady has easily won his race, also in Texas. 3 races occurring late down there due to a Supreme Court ruling which threw out some primary results earlier this year. They held their regular election in November. Nobody won a majority in 3 of those 13 districts, and so they had a runoff yesterday. Time for a couple more calls here. Let's go to Texas. Fort Worth, you reading the Star-Telegram?
Yes, I am, and just about what you're talking about, too. It says that West Texas win gives GOP a majority in state Senate. Loss ends Democrats' 124 years of top dogs in the upper chambers. I think I'm going to move someplace else. I'm a Democrat. And I'm real unhappy about this.
So the state Senate has turned over now?
Yes,
in the last election?
We're mainly Republicans here in Texas now. So we've got up in the upper chambers mostly Republicans to represent us, and I don't like that. I think it's kind of, well, I'm worried about it. Let's put it that way. And I'd like to say one other thing before I hang up.
Sure.
The other men that you had on just before now, they were wonderful. I thought they were great. I have been smoking marijuana for 28 years for arthritis, and it's a wonderful thing. I wish they would go ahead and decriminalize it or legalize it or something, because I've never had any other hard drugs, ever. The hardest drug I've ever taken has been from a doctor. So I really wish they would look into that, and if Philip Morris would if we quit smoking cigarettes, Philip Morris would lobby to legalize it, because there's nothing wrong with it. Anyway, you do a wonderful show. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thanks for calling. Let's go north from Fort Worth to Oklahoma. Is it Ponca City?
Yes. I'm reading the Ponca City News yesterday because our paper doesn't get here until the evening.
Where is that town located?
It's north central Oklahoma.
Gotcha.
It's actually Don Nichols' hometown. The headline of the article says, Inhofe seeking local help to block EPA regulations, and expresses early in the article about his concern about Carol Browner, head of the EPA. But environmental regulations wasn't my particular issue that I wanted to talk about. Buried in the article is a real interesting comment that I wish you'd make a note of and bring up to other guests that you might have on your panel. It says, the outspoken senator said that Browner was a former member of Vice President Al Gore's staff, and that there's a strong feeling in Washington that Gore will be called upon to finish Clinton's term as president. That's the part in the article that's of particular interest to me, and I really have no comment about it other than to simply ask that you run that comment by other guests who might have interest in that subject.
All right. And we'll look and see if we can find it in any of the papers here. Haven't seen that yet today. Let's go back out to L.A. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good. How you doing?
I'm fine. There's an article on the front page of the Los Angeles Times. The title is Lawmakers in Mexico Approve Dual Nationality. And what this is essentially a move to grant to 5 million or more Mexicans now living in the United States the right to retain their Mexican nationality. Now, we've been following this story for some time, and it's really quite interesting. What it is a reaction to Proposition 187. And in the story, they quote a fellow by the name of Jorge Bustamante, who is a professor of at a university in the northern part of Baja California. And he was the guy behind this. He actually structured this to encourage Mexicans to naturalize, because a lot of Mexicans do not want to become U.S. citizens if they lose their Mexican nationality. So this is a reaction to Prop 187. But let me just say this. Prop 187 was an attempt by Americans living in California to resist an invasion by Mexico. So what this is an attempt by the Mexican government to eliminate all resistance to that invasion, to let a lot of Mexicans now living in the United States vote against any attempt to control our borders or to restrict benefits to illegal aliens. So in our judgment, in my judgment, this is an aggressive act by Mexico, and the United States government should immediately halt all naturalization of Mexican nationals until this can be given a full hearing across the United States.
Caller, thanks for sharing the story and your thoughts with us. Time for a couple more phone calls, then we're going to have a discussion concerning capital punishment and the death penalty. Let's go to New York City.
Yes, hello?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm calling in response to an article that was written in the New York Post. The headline is about the agony of JFK's mistress. The article is written by Liz Smith, and I'm reading the article and I'm reflecting on some information that Mark Lane brought to my school when I was a college student, and putting it all together, it seems that she seems to be indicating that perhaps a government agency such as the FBI could have been involved with the assassination of Kennedy, and that the mob may have been getting national security information from Kennedy, and the mobsters who may have received that information perhaps were killed, or two of them were killed, and they could have been killed because of that.
Caller, what interests you about that story, of all the stories in the paper that you could have brought to the table?
It just seems that this issue never goes away. It just keeps popping up, new information periodically. What interests me in particular about this woman is that she seems to be one of the sole survivors who may have some information regarding that period of time.
All right, let's go to Mississippi. Ocean Springs, you're next.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, yes, I'm calling about the same-sex marriage issue. I'm looking at a headline here that says, homosexual agenda derailed by 104th Congress. My question is, why does the topic of marriage have to even be defended? I mean, after all, if we go back into civilizations, into history, into culture, we know that marriage is between a man and a woman, not between people of the same sex. And I think the whole debate here is not one of civil rights for a particular group. I believe everybody is guaranteed civil rights under the Civil Rights Act and under the Constitution. I don't believe that anybody should be given special sexual privileges based upon their so-called sexual orientation. Now, where is this going to end? I mean, this debate, when we're talking about rights for homosexuals, I mean, if we grant them rights based on their sexual behavior, why not grant pedophiles or any other sexual pervert or deviant rights, so-called rights, and just base it on their sexual preference? I mean, we've got to draw the line somewhere. There's got to be a standard for right and wrong.
All right, caller. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us. We are going to talk about the death penalty and capital punishment in a couple minutes. A couple of other quick program reminders. We're going to have a hearing at 10:30 a.m. Eastern here on C-SPAN concerning intelligence issues. President Clinton at 12:15 Eastern Time. If that hearing is done, it's going to be on C-SPAN. If not, we're going to have that on C-SPAN 2. And we'll be back in a couple moments.
Next, a look at the issue of capital punishment on the rise again in the United States 20 years after it was reinstituted. We're joined by Richard Dieter of the Death Penalty Information Center and John Pemberton of the Washington Legal Fund. First, the Indonesian ambassador to the United States talked yesterday about the crisis in East Timor.
Minister Ali Alatas said a couple of days ago that the Nobel Peace Prize to Mr. Ramos-Horta and Bishop Belo may provoke more problems in East Timor. Would you like to do you care to comment on what the minister meant with that?
I am aware of those remarks. What we hope in Indonesia is that also this Nobel Prize award will lead to more intensive talks between Portugal and Indonesia under the auspices of the United States Secretary General. As you know, as I mentioned also in my speech, these negotiations have been going on, and there are indications that they could lead to acceptable solution in the future.
The laureates have also called for a ceasefire, or for a withdrawal of the military presence, or reduction of the military presence of Indonesia in East Timor. And the armed wing of the resistance said they're ready for a ceasefire. Would your government welcome that?
Well, what is important is, of course, to have a comprehensive peace negotiation. Like I said, this negotiation started already a couple of years ago under the auspices of the UN Secretary General, and we would like to continue that and to take all aspects of the problem into consideration.
Yes, ma'am.
Tracy Wall, in the editorial today in the New York Times, Carlos Bello says that there are still many East Timorese who are imprisoned and face widespread human rights violations by the Indonesian government specifically. In your presentation, you underplayed that. Could you respond to some of the claims that he makes in that editorial?
As I mentioned in my speech, our record is not without mistakes, not without errors. There are some violations of human rights, but we considered our task to correct these possible violations. We had these incidents in Delhi. Unfortunately, it happened with many casualties, and those who were responsible were brought to trial, and they got sentences. And we learn from our mistakes. Like I mentioned before, it is our task, not only of the government, but the whole population, to see to it these violations do not occur. And as I mentioned also before, we have established a branch of the Human Rights Commission in East Timor. And the Human Rights Commission has come up with a number of findings, which sometimes deviate from those of the official ones. And I think they have done a very good job, and that is another indication of our commitment to improve our record of human rights.
Now a look at what our cameras are covering today. A Democratic Leadership Council forum discussing the '96 elections and economic issues. A review of national security issues by CIA Director John Deutsch, and a speech by President Clinton at the Democratic Leadership Council, all live. We're also covering a hearing on Swiss assets of the Holocaust victims, a discussion on money and politics, and a couple of news conferences, one on the Texas House runoff elections, the other on welfare reform by the U.S. Conference of Mayors. We'll have schedule updates for airtimes of these events throughout the day and at 8 o'clock tonight. Washington Journal continues.
We are going to spend the balance of this program talking about capital punishment. One of the stories that has us thinking about this issue comes from just next door, the state of Virginia. Larry Stout has been executed for murdering a Virginia shopkeeper 9 years ago. He's 33, put to death by injection. Is the sixth person that Virginia has executed this year and the second of 5 scheduled for this month. So we want to use that topic sort of as a springboard to a capital punishment discussion here 20 years after it was reinstated around the U.S. We're joined by 2 guests here. To my left is Richard Dieter of the Death Penalty Information Center. Thanks a lot for joining us. Along with John Pemberton of the Washington Legal Foundation. Thank you, too, for joining us. First, talk to us about the numbers. This story indicates that Virginia is rising. We read that other states are rising as well in terms of the number of people put to death. What are the numbers, and why is the situation the way it is?
Well, there's been an increase in the numbers. The Department of Justice came out showing in 1995 that there was 56 people were executed in 1995. The reason, there's multiple reasons for the increase in executions. One, there's been some changes in the laws that limit the appellate process slightly. While those laws haven't truly taken effect, we will see those more this year and in the following year. Also, I think there's been a trend. It's seen that these individuals are carrying on an enormous amount of frivolous appeals, and we've seen the judicial system trying to limit those appeals. So that is sped up the process, which has allowed for more executions.
What do you think about it?
Well, you know, I think it's correct that the executions are increasing. I think what we're experiencing is a deregulation of the death penalty. That is, the laws that were put in place to protect against mistakes in death penalty cases are being removed. Appeals are being quickened, the avenues of appeals are being cut out, and some of the money for defense attorneys to carry on these appeals is also being cut. And we have sort of a situation like we had with the Value Jet disaster, where not enough regulation means that disasters can happen. So there's an increasing danger that mistakes will be made, innocent people will be executed with this rush to executions.
Well, I don't totally agree with that. I think we still have an inordinate amount of appellate process for these individuals who have been sentenced to death. They have the full state system, they have their full federal appeals, and they still have the habeas corpus appeals. The legislation limited some of the federal appeals in the habeas corpus area very slightly. I think there's still room for more limit on the appellate process. We have a lot of cases where there's extreme amount of frivolous appeals. Rarely is there an appeal that an individual is claiming innocence. So I think while there's been some reform in the laws, there still is a lot of room, still giving every one of these individuals more than their due process rights and more of their day in court.
Well, for every person, we've had 355 executions now in these 20 years that the death penalty has been going on. And in that same period of time, we've had 66 people who were innocent, who were on death row, waiting to be executed, who were, found guilty by beyond a reasonable doubt and sentenced to death, but then turned out to be innocent and have been released, fortunately. In other words, for every 5 or 6 people we execute, we find somebody who never should have been on death row in the first place. And if we, and I must say, it took an average of 7 years to discover those cases. So if we cut the appeals process down to 4 years, we're obviously going to be executing innocent people. I don't think the American people wants that. But that's going to be the result of this move to say, well, frivolous appeals. These are constitutional rights that are being raised in these appeals. These are not frivolous. These are important issues. And what I am disturbed about, I'm starting to see courts say, yes, there's a lot of doubt about this person's guilt. This happened in the case of Joseph Payne, who came within hours of execution in Virginia just a couple weeks ago. They realized that the chief witness against Joseph Payne was a liar, but they weren't willing to stop it. His case went through all the courts and was approved for execution. That's not the way the system's supposed to work.
Well, I think the system clearly worked in that case, and I think it's clearly worked in all the cases where people have been released from death row. No advocate of the death penalty would ever want an innocent person executed. Those people that were released is an example of where the system's worked. The appellate process has seen where facts were inaccurate, they have seen where the trial court was incorrect, and they've released individuals, and that's a great example of the system working. The Joseph Payne case is another example of the system working. He went through his appellate process. The facts that the defense was putting forth would not have been allowed in through the judicial system, so we have the clemency right. We allow the governor to grant the individual clemency, and this system worked there. I agree with the Joseph Payne case. I think the facts were enough that there was not enough facts to decide that this individual should be executed, and I think the governor did a good job in that case.
We have another half hour on this topic, so we'll put the phone numbers up on the screen for you to phone in with your questions and comments for our guests. We have the split lines here. We'll be till 10 o'clock, excuse me, 10 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time. Our guests mentioned the Joseph Payne case. Joining us on the phone from Virginia is Frank Green with the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Good morning.
Morning.
How are you doing today?
A little sleepy, but fine.
Talk to us, there's a lot of things to talk about here. First, what happened in Virginia last night, what is going to happen, and then talk a little bit about that Payne case that we just talked about.
Well, last night, Larry Allen Stout was executed for a murder and robbery that happened in 1987. He's the second of 5 people scheduled to be executed by December 18th in Virginia. I think you just gave a very good account of the Joseph Payne case. Some of the problems that came up in that really illustrated problems with the death penalty across the country. We had, in that case, 4 of the jurors, when given the information about the chief witness, who was a fellow prison inmate, expressed real regret over having found him guilty and sentencing him to death. Now, that wasn't something considered by the governor, but one of the more disturbing things one of them said was that in their deliberations they acted on gut feelings, which is a pretty strong statement in a capital punishment case, and you have to wonder how often that goes on. On the other hand, Virginia cases, I think, average between 8 and 9 years between the time of the crime and the time of execution. So these cases do drag on for quite a while, and they're very demanding for everyone involved. The families of the victims, the families of the condemned person, the courts involved. It's a very debilitating kind of a process.
Frank, why are the numbers rising in Virginia? To what do you attribute that?
Part of it, toward the end of this year, is coincidence. Part of it is some changes that went into effect in July of 1995 that set deadlines in some of these appeals. I'm not sure specifically what they are, but there had been a bottleneck that got freed up, and that's why we're running into a spate of them here toward the end of this year.
Either of you folks want to jump in here?
Well, I mean, just to say that, you know, the Virginia courts have been very reluctant to overturn any of these cases which have pointed to probable innocence. They've had a number of these cases, and yet in what they call post-conviction relief in Virginia, nobody in 20 years has gotten this relief. This is a disturbing trend where judges get elected and appointed, promising to carry out the death penalty, and governors and attorney generals say we're going to carry it out more quickly. All of this can come at the expense of people's constitutional rights, and you know, that's not the way the system is supposed to work. And Virginia is now, this year, the nation's leader. Nobody has more executions this year than Virginia. They're rolling these cases through, and that's not going to, you know, catch those innocent cases. We can't depend on the commutation by a governor, which is a very chancy process. There's no review of it. There's no due process. You just hope that the governor will you know, feel like giving a commutation, and you know, as opposed to a system in which evidence is brought forth by both sides and argued in a court of law. That's the way we're supposed to find out if a mistake has been made, and not depend on the whim or goodwill of the governor.
Well, one thing that needs to be pointed out, the Joseph Payne case is a very irregular situation. That is why it's getting so much attention. So one, I don't think you can use that as an example for an argument against the death penalty. Two, to go back about the jury issue, I think it's sad that the jury is brought into this because these people are not accountable after they have found this individual guilty and found the death penalty is the correct punishment. Of course, it's human nature once it gets time near the execution to feel guilty about what you've done 10 years later, but that's part of the jury process. And to put these people on the spot and say, how do you feel about this individual being executed in a week is very tough, and I think it hurts the jury system, and I think it's going to hurt the legal system overall. So I think to look at those individuals, you have to really look at them and put yourself in their shoes and realize the guilt that they're going to feel. But they did their job, and they did it correctly, and they came to a unanimous decision that this individual was supposed to be sentenced to death.
Frank Green, how much attention is all of this getting throughout your state? I don't have your paper here on the set.
I think as they pick up in frequency, the news value declines. It's like anything else. The more often it happens, the less coverage it tends to get. We do have a couple of high-profile cases coming up. Thursday, the execution of Lem Tuggle scheduled. He's the last surviving death row inmate who escaped in 1984 from the Mecklenburg Correctional Center. 6 inmates escaped. He's the last remaining one. And then on Wednesday, there's a case of Joseph Odell, which is attracting some international attention. He has made some, he is claiming innocence, and his attorneys have marshaled a great deal of evidence, but have been unable to get courts to consider it at this point.
What is the governor saying these days, Governor Allen, about all this?
I don't imagine he's had a very nice Christmas season at this point. He does study all of these cases very carefully. His counsel considers them. They meet with the lawyers. He has only, again, commuted one sentence, and that was Joseph Payne's. But he really studies these carefully, takes responsibility seriously.
Frank Green of the Richmond Times-Dispatch, thanks a lot for joining us and sharing that information.
Sure.
We talked about Virginia there. We have a graphic that goes back to 1995 and talks about the top 5 states in terms of executions. Texas leads the list there with 19. Missouri, followed by Illinois, Virginia, and Florida. Can you, each of you, just take a couple minutes, take us around the country a little bit and give us some more insight into what's going on there?
Well, let me start with some of the numbers. Actually, the number of executions this year is less than last year, and largely that's due to the fact that the states and the federal government have passed laws trying to streamline the appeals process, but have actually made it more complicated, and challenges are underway to see whether these new laws are constitutional. Instead of Texas leading the way, Texas has had 3 executions this year, 19 last year, because they've tried to rush the appeals process, but didn't provide attorneys for the cases. So, this system of ever increasing the pace of executions can be backfiring. I think we've built up a system of appeals and the necessity of providing attorneys. We've built that up over the years, and we should preserve that. If we just take away the regulations, take away the oversight, we're going to find more problems, and we might not even speed up the executions, at least judging by what's happening this year.
It's totally correct when you have new statutes that it takes some time for the legal system to go through and make sure that they're constitutionally drafted, and it will take some time, but the end result is to speed up the judicial process. I mean, last year, or the 1995 numbers say that it was 11.2 years average individual on death row. Of that, 1.8% of the individuals on death row were executed. So if we want a system which the reason for the death penalty is to be a deterrent, we have to have a system that is effective and is timely in its manner. People, for the death penalty to be a deterrent, have to see an individual commit a crime, and then if the crime is so heinous the jury finds that the death penalty is the correct sentence, then we have to see that carried out in a timely manner to show it all in one time segment so that you can see what happens when you commit such a crime. Right now, I think the appellate process is longer than should be. I think people realize that everyone deserves their due appeals, but I think a lot of times we see a lot of abuse of this system, and that's a serious problem.
Before we go to the phones, how many people are on death row nationwide?
3,150. Correct.
And this chart here talks about how many are on death row from each particular state. We can work our way down there. You can see Texas at 404, but that is topped by California at 420. Is that just a matter of the population and the size of the state, or
and the murder rate? I mean, these states that have high death rows often have high murder rates too. It's not exactly working that if you have a lot of people sentenced to death, your murder rate's going to plummet. The states without the death penalty are generally the ones with the lower murder rates.
Well, in response to that, that is true, but the thing is the death penalty is not the only deterrent to crime. You have to look at the whole criminal system. Texas crime rate is very high, so the states that have the death penalty have an increasing crime rate as well. If you look at counties, though, specifically Harris County in Houston, which from 1990 to 1995 had the most executions of any other county or state, showed a 40% reduction in murder rates. They say if that execution rate is carried out to this year, it'll have a 60% reduction. So it does work if carried out correctly.
Let's go to Lenox, Massachusetts, our first call. Thanks for hanging on. Good morning. Are you there?
Hello, yes. I wanted to point out a few things about capital punishment. That first of all, Western Europe has no capital punishment and it has a much lower crime rate. Second, that the U.S. has plenty of means to incarcerate people and to permanently separate them from society, and that it is to punish in this sort of way, which is against, obviously, the Fifth Commandment says, "Thou shalt not kill," and the general tendency is in this country is anti-abortion and pro-capital punishment, so it's inconsistent, and also it generally seems to be politically motivated. That when a governor or somebody else wants to be elected, except in the case of Cuomo in New York, they first of all have to advocate capital punishment.
All right, thank you. You agree with that?
Well, I think the caller made a number of good points. One about the world trend is away from the death penalty. At least if we look at our allies, they're stopping the use of the death penalty, and they have lower murder rates than us. So there's something that we should be learning from them. Another good point is that there's a lot of crime in the United States, and it should be of concern. We deal with almost all of it without the death penalty. And, you know, I'm talking about 22,000 murders, and almost all of that is dealt without the death penalty. We could deal with the few cases that are dealt with the death penalty in the same way and avoid all the dangers of executing innocent people, the racism that the death penalty has caused. So, you know, I think we should look to alternatives as the rest of the world is starting to do, and I think politicians should stop using the death penalty to get elected. That's what's fueling this thing. I don't think it's working. I don't think it's a good government program. It's a very wasteful government program. Highly expensive, time-consuming, and not productive. We don't see the murder rates dropping across the country because of the death penalty.
Mr. Pemberton used the international example, and we can point out another chart that we have here from a recent Washington Post story. Countries with the most executions in 1995, the U.S. at number 4 there, China with over 2,000, followed by Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, then the U.S., and you can see the rest of the chart there.
The caller was correct, and the numbers are correct in that the other Eastern Europe countries do not use the death penalty, but she was also correct by saying they don't have the crime rate that we have. So you cannot compare, you're comparing apples to oranges. So if you look at Saudi Arabia and China, they have a very low murder rate. It's due, one, because they're very expedient in carrying out the death penalty. I don't agree with their legal process. I think I agree with our Constitution, I agree with our appellate process. So while those countries show that it is a deterrent, that you need to have your legal steps to protect the innocent. Life in prison without parole as a equivalent to the death penalty is not correct. You have a lot of crimes committed in prisons. You have a lot of individuals that if they're put in prison, life in prison without parole, what is their incentive not to kill people in prison? So you have to protect the rights of the other inmates in prison, and you have to protect the rights of the guards. There's numerous cases. There was a case in New York where an individual was sentenced to life in prison without parole, talked a guard into the chapel, and murdered her brutally. So you have to think about those people's rights as well. So it's not the equivalent. It also takes away from the deterrent effect. Before New York had the death penalty, there was many cases where they had interviews and saying, why did you murder the individual after you robbed him? It's like, she identified me, she could have potentially pointed me out, and I wasn't going to get the death penalty, so it didn't really matter.
Many more angles we want to point out and pursue in this next 15 minutes. I want to point out on that last chart, those are figures from Amnesty International. Marietta, Oklahoma, our next call. Good morning.
Good morning. I have a question for Mr. Dieter. he gave a figure of 365 executions, and so many of them were innocent. Over that same period of time, I wondered if he'd tell us how many murders there were committed in the United States and how many of those victims were innocent victims. And also, I'd like to hear his comment that they always talk about the rights of the murderer and his family and their feelings. What about the rights of these victim families? And also, one other question, how many killers have been found innocent or have been turned loose and turned back into public because somebody didn't dot an I or cross a T, and they go right back out and kill somebody else? What about those? Are those people innocent?
All right, Caller, you laid a lot out. You want to respond to any of that?
Some points. Well, first of all, there's about 20,000 murders a year in the country, and I'd say all of the victims are innocent. But that doesn't give us the right to execute some more innocent people. I mean, we don't want to make two wrongs into a right. They, didn't have due process. No defending what murderers did. The question is, what should be done? And, you raised the point about people getting out. I mean, we can have sentences of life without possibility of parole, so that if a person is guilty of murder, they don't get out. California's had this statute for 25 years. Not one of the people sentenced to life without parole has been released. So people do not get out. Now, obviously, if they're innocent, what you called dotting I's and crossing T's, maybe, what we're talking about is the fact that these people were wrongly convicted, that someone lied on the witness stand. They should be released. And it's not true that people who get released go out and commit other crimes. These 66 people who I've pointed to in the past 20 years who have been innocent have not committed other murders. They were innocent. They shouldn't have been there in the first place. That's what's wrong.
Talk to us about cost, because that's an argument a lot of people make, that it's much more expensive to have someone go through the whole appeals process and be in prison rather than put to death.
Yes, the death penalty is a cost to the taxpayers. It's costing about $2 million per execution more than if this person went through a regular murder trial and was sentenced to life imprisonment. So there's a net cost. 70% of that cost is at the trial level. These trials are long. The jury has to be carefully selected. There's a guilt process, and then after that, a sentencing process, which is a whole separate trial. So it turns out to be enormously expensive. We could take that $2 million and put 30 or 40 more police on the streets for each execution. Or we could buy them bulletproof vests. We could do a lot of things that prevent crime. This one execution hasn't done anything.
I want to hear your thoughts on cost, but we're told that this caller has a similar comment concerning cost. So we'll hear from them first and then from you. Montrose, New York, is that right?
Yes.
Yes, what's your comment?
Yeah, just the other night I sat down with my family and we had a discussion about the cost of the death penalty after seeing the movie Dead Man Walking. And surprisingly, most of my family, who I thought had some compassion, thought that as far as taxes are concerned, that more people should be executed, and they think that it's cheaper, but it really isn't. From what I've read, the cost of executions goes up because of appeal cases and having more guards on death row, and it turns out to cost millions. It costs millions of dollars to execute somebody, especially here in New York State, than it does to keep them on death row.
All right, Mr. Pemberton?
Well, I think you have to look at the numbers. One, just so people understand, the reason why the death penalties are so expensive is the appeals process, the court time, the judge's time, the attorney's time. The numbers, though, there are statistics out that show that life in prison without parole actually is more costly than the death penalty. The reason for that is the numbers a lot of times used to do the comparison is the guard that's in general population. There are some numbers thrown out that it's basically around $34,000 a year to put an individual in general isolation. The problem is those aren't the individuals that would, and if they didn't get the death penalty, those individuals would most likely be put in isolation. That's a cost of anywhere from $64,000 a year. So you've got to look at apples to apples. When you start looking at the individuals that would not have gotten the death penalty put in isolations, the cost goes up extremely. And those numbers of saying $2.3 to $2.8 million for death row, that's saying $1.8 million is spent on their appellate process, because realistically they should only be in prison from 5 to 8 years. So their cost of their yearly upkeep of staying in the prison is much lower than someone that would be in life in prison without parole.
Can you remind us of what Congress has done in recent years regarding this issue?
Well, two things this year that Congress did. One was to cut the federal review process severely, cut what's called habeas corpus, something that goes back to the Magna Carta and is a fundamental principle in our Constitution. They attacked that in the guise of trying to deal with anti-terrorism. It was put in this Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. That went into effect in April. The second thing they did this year was to cut all the money for the what were called death penalty resource centers. These were small law firms that helped defendants on death row with their appeals. They had been federally funded. It was started in the Reagan administration to help the death penalty process work, and all of that money was removed this year. So those are the two most significant things. And a couple of years ago, they expanded the federal death penalty as a way of showing how tough they were going to be about crime, and Clinton used that to get his crime bill passed.
Your bio says you're a former high school math teacher. How did you get from that to this?
Well, teaching in Washington, D.C., I think is one of the things. I mean, seeing a lot of the injustice in the early 70s for me in the civil rights movement, and led me closer to, you know, what some of the causes of crime are and who gets in prison. You know, it's black people in prison, it's people who kill white people who get the death penalty. There's a lot of racism that goes on with this whole system, and this seemed to be a highly symbolic area, the death penalty. You know, where do we stand on the question of life? And that's what's led me to work on this full time.
Mr. Pemberton, talk to us about race and ethnicity in terms of the numbers.
The race is always an issue that's discussed. There are more white individuals on death row right now. There are more white individuals executed every year. The argument comes down to when a white person kills a black person or a black person kills a white person to get into the racial argument. The Supreme Court and no court has ever overturned a case saying that there was a racial reason for that sentencing. So no court has ever found that to be a reason. And actually, if you look at the numbers, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund always issues numbers. There is a statistically insignificant showing of any racial bias in the sentence or the death penalty. So while the argument is there, the numbers just don't stand up to the argument.
Go ahead.
Well, you know, that has to be challenged right away. I mean, the General Accounting Office looked at all the studies on the race of the death penalty and concluded that in 82% of these verifiable studies, these were, you know, carefully screened studies, there was a showing of racial discrimination with the death penalty, that if you kill a white person in this country, you're about 4.5 times more likely to get the death penalty than if you killed a black person, taking into account the differences in crime. These were very careful and award-winning studies that were done. And it's that. Yes, there's more white people executed in the country than black people, but that's because there's, 9 times as many white people in the country overall. Disproportionately, black people are being killed. 40% of those being executed are black, and they only represent 11% of the population. There's some real problems with race and the death penalty.
Well, I think you made some good points there. The mitigating factors of the crimes committed when a black individual kills a black individual versus a black individual killing a white person is key to every case. And that's why you can't look at these broad-based statistics. You have to look at every single case. A lot of times the mitigating factors, self-defense, some of the other issues that come in, are the reasons why you see more executions of black people that have killed white people, because it's in a crime that those mitigating circumstances don't exist. Also, the numbers, the cases have never overturned this, and this is an issue that's always brought up on appeal, and the judges look at it, and it has never been overturned. So the judicial system has looked at this and said it does not exist.
Let's go to Solomons Island, Maryland. Thanks for hanging on. Good morning.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I just don't understand, there seems to be so many smoke screens over this thing, this whole race thing you were talking about and everything. So many of my friends, I feel, I lived in Saudi Arabia, and I know there, the only crime committed there is done by foreigners. A Saudi Arabian will not commit crime because he knows the punishment. Punishment is swift, but I have to disagree. I think their system works, and I just don't understand why this country doesn't do something. It just doesn't make sense. You're selling guns to millions of guns to these people, and there's no control, and freedom is great and life is precious, but then why are we treating life like dirt? I don't understand it.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to disagree with some of the points, because I think there are ways to reduce crime. I think gun control is one of the key things that works in certain places. And we, you know, if we're going to have the freedoms that we have to look at whether there's some crime results. This dealing with the death penalty, you know, this occasionally taking one person out of 100 and executing them in the hopes that this is going to do something is the smokescreen. The death penalty is the smoke screen before the people's eyes as the solution offered for the crime problem. We have a crime problem and we should deal with it. You know, there are ways, community policing, you know, putting more police on the streets, gun control, drug programs, educational programs. There are ways to reduce crime. The death penalty hasn't been one of those things.
Well, I think crime, there's two ways to reduce crime. One, you have to increase your arrest rate, and two, you have to have the proper punishment for the crime. To get rid of the death penalty basically is telling people, we don't value these victims' lives that have been killed. We don't value your life as potentially being killed because we're taking away the death penalty, the ultimate deterrent, the ultimate sentence for someone to commit a heinous crime. So I don't see what the message would be if we took away the death penalty to the people that say, like the caller said, that we have an increasing crime rate, we have a serious problem and we have to deal with that. Yes, death penalty is only one aspect of controlling our crime, but it is a very important aspect, and right now we don't use it very often. I mean, like I said last year, 1.8% of the individuals on death row were executed. But I think with the laws that are being enacted and the reforms that are being done, we're going to see more people being executed, and I think properly getting their due process rights, and it will be a good program.
We have a viewer who sends a fax in to our anti-death penalty guest, as they put it. What stand does your anti-death penalty guest take on the issue of abortion? If he says he is pro-choice, does he also favor the continued legal status of partial birth abortion?
Well, I guess I'd have to say that as an organization, and I represent the Death Penalty Information Center, I'm the director, we have no stance at all on abortion. We simply look at the problems of the death penalty, and we don't even take you know, an absolute stance on that, but we say that the way the death penalty is being implemented is unfair, it's full of the danger of executing innocent people, it's enormously expensive, a waste of taxpayers' money, and therefore should at least be stopped, if not abolished altogether.
How are people being executed? We talked about lethal injection earlier. We know about some other methods. What is going on around
Lethal injection is the most popular. I think 32 out of 37 states use lethal injection. There is execution. In some states there is still firing squad and hanging. In those states, in most of those states you have a choice of method, but the most common method is lethal injection. And the argument that always goes along with this is this cruel and unusual punishment. Once again, the Supreme Court has never found any of these methods to be cruel and unusual punishment. The cruel and unusual punishment aspect of the Constitution was drafted when we had very barbaric methods of executing individuals. So I think you have to look at it in context. And when you look at cruel and unusual punishment, unusual goes to, is this unusually harsh for the crime that was committed? Obviously, if you kill somebody, I don't think anyone could say that it's unusually harsh to also kill that individual through execution. Cruel, you look at the actual method. Lethal injection has been found by most states to be the best method and the most humane.
Yeah, I want to point out one thing. I would think Mr. Pemberton agrees with that. The Supreme Court is not the last word on a lot of these issues. I mean, the fact that the Supreme Court has not yet said that the death penalty is cruel and unusual doesn't mean it isn't. I mean, they upheld slavery, they upheld a lot of problems in it, even with the race in the death penalty, which he points out that they haven't ruled that the death penalty is racist. The Supreme Court said this is an issue for the legislatures. Congress should look at racism in the death penalty and pass some laws, just as they've done in housing and education and other areas in which discrimination has been shown, to make sure that it isn't racist. That's what the Supreme Court said should be done.
Down to a couple minutes here. Boring, Oregon. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I wanted to comment on the fact that all of the executions that have taken place over the last few decades, or 4 or 5 decades rather, have been basically minorities, as everyone knows, who have not had the money to get proper defense. For example, in my opinion, O.J. Simpson, who has the money to defend himself after a terrible crime, walks away scot-free laughing, while these other people who were victims of the society's inability to provide them proper social equity in our society have just routinely been the ones who have gone and died for this, in my opinion, unconstitutional manner. That's all I really have to say. Except I think that the folks that actually carry out these sentences and do the work cannot possibly go home at night and just act like, oh, you know, it's cool. So anyways, think it over, man.
All right, thanks for calling in. Since we're down to about 2 minutes here, hold your thought on that. We'll get to that in just a sec. But I do want to run through some of the states that right now do not have a death penalty. We can put the list on the screen there for you. Alaska, the District of Columbia, Hawaii, Iowa, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan. We also have Minnesota, North Dakota, Rhode Island, Vermont, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. What's the future there?
Well, some of those states, there are politicians who say we need the death penalty there like they have it in the other states. Some places like Michigan haven't had the death penalty for 150 years, and I think they're going to hold on to that, and hopefully there may be some states which get tired of trying to use this death penalty process and all the frustrations and decide to get rid of it, which happened in the 60s and I think can happen again.
Mr. Pemberton, final thought.
I think we have to look at the death penalty as a whole and see what its actual reason is behind it, and that is to deter other individuals from committing these crimes, and as well as to take proper measures for individuals that have committed these heinous crimes. Many times we look at these defendants and we don't look at the actual crimes they committed, because the time between the crime happening and the time of execution is so far apart that we lose a sense of what actually happened. These are heinous crimes. The majority of these individuals that are put on death row, they say 60% of them have committed felons before, 14% of them actually murdered people before. These are not now with a lot of legislation.
Executive Director. Thank you both. Thanks a lot for your questions, comments.